This story was written in the early 1990s when I was told the information within was classified, secret, or confidential. Around 2018, I learned the information regarding my missions of gathering data pertaining to the MIs and POWs of the Vietnam was declassified. I wrote these stories out to leave for my children so they would have knowledge of their father. In 2024, I began to attempt to make all my stories, which consist of more than 14,000 typed pages, and transcribe them into audiobooks. This way it would be easier to listen to the story than to read them. This is my first attempt, and after completing my first story and listening again, I realized the recording and pronunciation are not as precise as I hoped it would be. Many of the names of people, places, and dates or words with numbers are mispronounced. The conversion from text to audio, and it's not proficient as well, and I hoped it would be. Let the story begin with an introduction. During the 1990s, I served as a federal agent, operating in Asian socialist countries under the guise of a high-paid tourist, wielding an American, French, or Canadian passport for cover. On occasion, a fellow female agent would accompany me, masquerading as my wife. This tactic was employed to confound the local secret police, who typically would not suspect espionage from individuals traveling with apparent family members. I was bound by a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, at the time, which restricted me from divulging classified information. After a span of 8 to 12 years, the classified nature of my operations was declassified. Subsequently, a nonfiction writer stumbled upon some of my after-action reports and transformed them into thrilling mystery, adventure, or spy novels. It's important to clarify that my role was not akin to the glamorous portrayal of a James Bond-type spy. Rather, I worked in a low-profile capacity, primarily focused on gathering intelligence related to American MI and POW. My official job description did not classify me as a spy, but rather as an agent tasked with specific information-gathering objectives. Despite that time, I underwent specialized training in various disciplines, though not at the same level as our nation's special forces. Much of my training served as refresher courses, as during my decade-long tenure, I never found myself in situations requiring the application of those advanced skills. However, I did receive extensive training in discreetly eliminating individuals deemed a significant threat to others. In such cases, I was adept at executing eliminations covertly, making it appear as though the deed had been carried out by an animal, leaving behind no discernible forensic evidence. The term "make it appear as if the dog did it" became a commonly used phrase, similar to in the movie of Godfather, "make him an offer he can't refuse," or the TV movie series known as Yellowstone when the phrase "take him to the train station." During my tenure in the 1990s while working under the Clinton administration, the term "send him a letter" was used and referred to sending someone a letter or having them drink a liquid that appeared as soda, beer, or a mixed drink where a chemical agent was added. Only those individuals with the letter Y added to their name identity had that authority, same as in the James Bond movie series where you had to be a 00 agent, 7 if you were licensed to kill. I didn't have that Y designator yet. I was still trained to make it appear as if the dog did it with no forensic evidence left behind. The term "painting someone" was an indication that you had obtained all the information needed to find the individual again if needed. I first learned of this back when my team was in January 1991, when we located Saddam Hussein voice print and we dispatched 2 F Hornets that took out a building in Baghdad, missing Saddam by 3 minutes. If we were able to get a copy of your voice, then you were painted, and the next time you spoke on a cell phone, we were able to locate you where you were in the world. You can run, but you can't hide, and if you run from me, you're going to be out of breath when you die. That was one of the sayings in my section. This is how we find terrorists and dispatch a missile-carrying drone to set you on fire from above. All my training of that day is today dinosaur technology. Now we have an app and you drop your suspect voice print into the app, and as soon as that person begins talking on a phone, there is a resource available in a moment instead of an hour wait before you can splash that individual by conventional means. Disclaimer: to protect the anonymity of individuals in this book, I have provided them with pseudonyms which were uncommon to me at that moment in time. Since the violation of some military laws does not have a statute of limitations, I've decided to protect myself from what might be controversial and unethical behavior. For that reason, I will initiate my literary license to replace my character on occasion with a fictitious name. I make no apology for my actions or reactions to events that occurred during my 14-month tour in the Republic of Vietnam, or later when I served as a federal agent working in Asian socialist countries gathering information while traveling as a tourist. Once again, I did have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, NDA. There is nothing within the massive book that would jeopardize national security. In my first war, most of us were teenagers. We were an adolescent army with no experiences in our life to compare with the horrors of war or the emotional trauma that accompanies combat. We followed by example, and most of the horrible examples were taught to us by the enemy. All the events that are written within this book are true to the best of my remembrance, and my remembrance is excellent, especially since I wrote it down in 2 or 3 bullet comments. Although this book was written more along the lines of a novel, it is based 99% upon the truth. The accounts in the story are as I recorded them every day. It is just the language and deliverance has been changed to make it a little more enjoyable to read. To my children, grandchildren, or whoever, I've occasionally been likened to a James Bond figure, but that comparison couldn't be further from reality. There were no fancy gadgets or sleek vehicles in my line of work. I traveled in a 16-passenger van or the Vietnamese Zichlo 3-wheeled bicycle taxi, both of which were devoid of missile attachments or any such extravagance needed to elude the secret police or the foreign affairs officers who constantly followed me or sometimes chased me, which on a couple occasions lead to their accidental death that a dog on the highway had caused. You never put all of that into your required 12-page after-action report unless you want to answer 1,000 questions for which many of them you don't have the answer. Throughout my travels, I encountered numerous beautiful women trying to get something from me, most of whose primary interest lay in securing an American husband. These individuals were willing to utilize whatever asset they had as women to achieve their goal, yet they refrained from involvement in gathering information or embarking on adventures that could potentially lead to their arrest. The most common question asked me by almost all of these women that I met in Asian socialist countries was, "Do you work for the CIA?" This led me to believe that the government put stories like this into the minds that all foreigners were possibly spies. In Vietnam, strict laws prohibited unmarried females from staying in hotel rooms with foreigners. Breaching this law could result in severe consequences. The woman might be publicly shamed with her image published in local police newspapers, and many times they were photographed nude with black line censorship over parts of their body, then labeled as a prostitute and sentenced to labor in the rice paddies for years. Meanwhile, the male counterpart could face house arrest, confiscation of belongings, and immediate deportation without the chance of obtaining a visa to return to the country. As you delve into these narratives, you might be inclined to assume that my portrayal of detailed conversations involves a fair amount of creative embellishment. However, this is not the case. All these conversations were meticulously recorded back in the 1990s. I had a compact audio recorder in my pocket disguised as a pack of Chesterfield cigarettes that I recorded conversations and later transferred them over to Radio Shack tape recorder where all the blank tapes were pre-labeled with a Vietnamese singer's name to avoid arousing suspicion. In 1990, my mission took me to Vietnam with a specific objective: to locate downed aircraft, retrieve crucial letter documents, and secure a 16mm film that depicted instances of American EOWS undergoing torture. A prevailing concern existed that numerous American prisoners had potentially met their demise in the confines of captivity in Hanoi, succumbing to brutal beatings. In stark contrast, the Vietnamese government's stance attributed their deaths to the downing of their aircraft. Our mission aimed to shed light on this enigma by acquiring tangible evidence in the form of films showcasing living EOWS who had later been categorized as casualties within their aircraft. As I transcribed these narratives, I confronted the challenge of translating hundreds of pages of handwritten notes and numerous hours of audio recordings into typed text. While maintaining a meticulous and professional presentation was essential, it wasn't the primary focus at that moment. As a result, the stories you're about to delve into were crafted hastily and represent only a fraction of the complete narrative, containing elements that may be of interest to the casual reader. Now let the stories begin. Mission 1. Early in the morning, I found myself in my home in Lake Louis, Missouri, packing clothing items that my Stevenson had entrusted me with, intending to carry them to Vietnam for her family. The task proved challenging, as I couldn't fit everything into suitcases alone. Opting for practicality, I decided to discard the suitcases and utilize 2 army duffel bags and my trusty old military Alice backpack. My primary concern lay with the potential hazards of food and water in that foreign land, particularly the risk of encountering unpleasant bouts of diarrhea. Thus, I carefully packed 32 military meals ready to eat Marie to sustain me during my journey. Amidst these provisions, I managed to squeeze in a few pairs of blue jeans, shirts, and a handful of military logo t-shirts, all chosen to help me blend in as a returning soldier to a place haunted by past nightmares. My bags were bursting at the seams, crammed with my Stevenson's clothing, leaving not an ounce of vacant space. With my preparations complete, I departed from St. Louis, embarking on my journey with TWA, first flying to LA, and then transferring to the International Flight Terminal. There, I secured my tickets and boarded Philippines Airlines, bound for the Philippines, and ultimately Saigon. It's important to note that at the time, it was illegal for an American to travel directly to Vietnam. As a result, I had to navigate a change of planes in Manila, and from there, I made the final leg of my journey into Saigon, still on Philippines Airlines. Having traveled thousands of miles on domestic American Airlines, I can unequivocally attest that the Asian carriers consistently exceeded expectations in their treatment of passengers, surpassing the standards of their American counterparts in terms of service and hospitality. Gazed out of my window as the plane circled above Saigon, descending gently. Memories of my initial arrival in Saigon came flooding back. The vivid recollection of a landscape ablaze with burning fires that had been ignited by Americans using diesel fuel to incinerate human waste and cut off 55-gallon barrels. But this time around, there were no fires, just a grimy little city sprawled below. As the plane touched down and the cabin door swung open, I was instantly struck by a familiar wave of intense heat reminiscent of that scorching July 6, 1968. The only thing absent on this journey was the stewardess's voice blaring over the loud cabin speaker, playfully announcing that we had taken a wrong turn in the air and somehow ended up in Nashville, Tennessee. As I disembarked from the plane, descending down the ramp, I encountered two Vietnamese soldiers stationed at the base of the stairs, their AK-47s held in a ready position. They exchanged a brief glance and muttered to each other in Vietnamese, recognizing me as an American, pronounced Z. I responded with a friendly smile and a casual salute, as though they were my appointed bodyguards, but they paid me no heed. With my army backpack in tow, I proceeded to cover a considerable distance of about 400 feet from the airplane to the terminal. The terminal itself bore a striking resemblance to an oversized chicken coop, its door hanging on rubber tires serving as makeshift hinges, and its windows adorned with chicken wire. The temperature inside this humble structure was sweltering, exacerbated by the presence of approximately 150 Vietnamese men, women, and children who impatiently jostled in line, eager to approach the three Vietnamese officials stationed behind the desk. Within their U.S. passports lay stacks of American dollars serving as bribes to expedite the customs process and obtain the necessary passport stamp that would grant them access to another building where they could retrieve their luggage. I found myself among the last in line, finally reaching the desk as I handed over my American passport to the official. I had both my American passport, complete with a U.S. visa for entering the country, and my Canadian passport issued by the State Department, which I intended to use during my travels. My plan was simple. Show only my American passport and discreetly stash away the Canadian one in my luggage as I journeyed. Upon presenting my passport to the Vietnamese customs official, he scrutinized it and then looked up at me, remarking in English that something appeared to be missing, implying money. I calmly responded, urging him to take another look and assuring him that nothing was amiss. I cautioned against causing any complications that might have repercussions. Reluctantly, he stamped my passport, and he was handed another passport with two $100 bills protruding from its pages. Thirsty and drenched in sweat from the relentless heat, I wondered why it seemed that only Americans perspired while the Vietnamese around me appeared cool and refreshed in the sweltering climate. A wire fence separated me from the people outside, waiting for their loved ones. Among the crowd, a stunning Vietnamese young woman caught my eye, presumably Mrs. My James. A uniformed man approached, loaded my two army duffel bags onto a flat cart, and requested a $20 arrival tax for Vietnam. I chuckled at his request, telling him that I considered on the day pigs learned to fly. With a bemused expression, I removed the bags from the cart, and he persisted, insisting that all foreigners must pay. He then directed me to see the customs officials before I could leave. The customs official proceeded to ask me a series of questions and informed me that I couldn't travel within Vietnam unescorted. I had to go through Saigon Tourism. He handed me a sheet of paper containing the company's address and phone number. He began his inquiry by asking whether I had served as an American soldier in Vietnam, inquiring about my place of residence, my military duties, my intended destination, and my choice of accommodation. He insisted that I stay exclusively in a government-owned hotel, with no exceptions. This back-and-forth questioning went on for a painstaking 30 minutes. Frustrated, I decided to take matters into my own hands, producing a notebook and pen to jot down his name from his shirt ID. Curious about my actions, he inquired, and I responded by suggesting that if he continued to present me with difficulties, I might return the favor. I voiced my belief that his questions were entirely unnecessary. Flipping the paper over, I revealed the business card of Secretary Tran Minh Dong, the third Vietnamese secretary at the United Nations, complete with his fax number on the back. I informed him that Mr. Zung was an acquaintance of mine and might have a word with his superior. At that point, he abruptly changed tactics, demanding that I open my two duffel bags and empty their contents onto the floor for a weapons inspection. I meticulously transcribed this demand onto the paper as he observed my actions. He then mentioned that he had once killed an American in combat and inquired whether I had ever shot a Vietnamese soldier. I laughed at first, then adopted a stern expression, telling him that I wouldn't want to alarm him by sharing the number of Viet Cong I had dispatched and found satisfaction in doing so. Initially baffled, he seemed to grasp the implication and instructed me to leave after inspecting only half of my scattered clothing on the concrete floor. As I wrestled to cram everything back into my bags, sweat poured down my face in torrents. Upon finishing, I dragged the bags towards the exit door, where the persistent man who had earlier requested a $20 arrival tax pursued me. Ignoring his request once more, I walked away without paying. Little did I know that this man would cross my path several more times. He appeared to be the secret police assigned to monitor me at the airport. As I made my way through the gate, I spotted a former American soldier wearing a Vietnam veteran hat, seated in a wheelchair, and missing his legs. We exchanged a heartfelt welcome home, a password shared among Vietnam veterans. He informed me that he had been residing in Vietnam for the past 3 months, patiently awaiting the delivery of his medications, presumably from the VA Veterans Affairs. He mentioned living in Saigon, having a girlfriend, and enjoying a comfortable life for less than $800 a month, complete with a personal driver. Amidst the bustling crowd, my James managed to navigate her way towards me and asked if I was John. The veteran cast a glance at her and then at me, remarking, "Man, you're already doing okay." Mai instructed me to follow her, and together, we maneuvered through a few holes, emerging onto a bustling street teeming with people and filled with the pungent aroma of fish sauce known as nak miok, the scent that lingered heavily in the air. During my training at FT Sill, Oklahoma, we were gathered in a room and provided with a lesson on the art of observation and memory retention. We listened attentively as we were instructed to pay close attention to our surroundings. Subsequently, we were led out of the room, given a break, and then asked to return. Upon our return, we were tasked with the challenge of documenting any alterations or omissions in the classroom environment. This exercise focused on memory recall, and I had a hunch during the initial hour of training that it would culminate in this task. So, before our brief 5-minute hallway break, I made a concerted effort to commit every detail of the sparsely decorated room to memory. This exercise was aptly named the Sherlock Holmes syndrome, emphasizing the importance of keen observation and the ability to analyze one's environment as a crucial tool for survival. Throughout our training, we encountered various intriguing names for the different aspects of our instruction. As anticipated, after our short break, we were indeed instructed to record all the changes we had observed in the classroom. They instructed us to identify the 10 changes in the room, and I diligently noted down the following alterations: the flag, the window shade, the books on the shelf, the desk's repositioning, the writings on the whiteboard behind the desk, the marker's placement, the time displayed on the clock, and even the unbuttoned button on the female instructor's military blouse. In total, I listed 12 distinct differences. When asked if I had received this training previously, I responded in the negative, but I had sensed that such a question might arise, prompting me to pay close attention. During our stay at the on-base hotel suite in FT, Sill, around 12 of us shared a spacious suite on the top floor, requiring us to use the elevator to reach our destination. Once inside the suite, one soldier inquired if anyone had noticed a magazine left on a chair near the elevator. One of the guys correctly identified it as People magazine, another questioned which page it was open to, and yet another pinpointed it to page 20. It became apparent that they were more adept at this exercise than I was. From that moment on, I became more attuned to my surroundings, and we were subjected to 2 additional unannounced tests to assess our mastery of the Sherlock Holmes syndrome. Eventually, we all became proficient at observing and analyzing everything in our environment. As we navigated the narrow streets of Saigon, strategically choosing back roads to evade the toll typically imposed on airport taxi passengers, I continued to hone my Sherlock syndrome skills, endeavoring to commit our route to memory. Saigon possessed the potential to be a stunning city, yet it appeared to languish in a state of poverty and disrepair, with remnants of destruction left unattended since the city's fall. My gaze fixated on the radio tower at Tan Son An Hut Airfield, adorned with bullet holes that had remained unrepaired for 15 years. The neglect of these bullet holes led me to believe that financial resources for repairs were scarce. In close proximity to the tower, 3 Russian Hind helicopters rested, slowly succumbing to rust emblematic of the lingering bitterness from 1975. Nearby, 2 Korean warrior jets sat as well. The only challenge I encountered in memorizing our surroundings was the multitude of Vietnamese words adorning the walls, a language foreign to me. Once we successfully navigated around the toll gates, we entered a prominent 4-lane street in Saigon. My attention was drawn to an elderly man clad in tattered rags, his body wrapped in bandages that revealed red blood seeping through the cloth. I felt a strong urge to stop and assist him, but my James informed me that this man had been engaging in this act for years. I inquired incredulously, "You mean he lies in the middle of heavy traffic, forcing cars to swerve around him?" She confirmed, "Yes, you'll encounter many like him if you spend some time in Saigon." True to her words, I would encounter this very same man lying in the middle of the street on 3 separate occasions in the following days. During a subsequent trip to Saigon, I would cross paths with him again, and this time he surprised me by rising from the street, making his way to a cafe, and then departing on his Honda motorcycle. The scene reminded me of New York City, a place known for its share of scams, hustles, and deceit in the pursuit of the American dollar. However, it's important to refrain from making sweeping generalizations about any city based on the actions of a few individuals. My James escorted me to her father's residence and informed me that she had arranged a hotel for me just a few doors away. Despite being offered a lunch meal, I politely declined everything except a can of soda. It was against the law for a foreigner to stay in a non-government-owned hotel, though this fact was often unknown to most Vietnamese. Foreigners were a rare sight in Vietnam, primarily consisting of Japanese nationals. So, while it was technically illegal, I pleaded ignorance of the law as my potential defense if ever questioned about staying in a non-government hotel. Upon arriving at the hotel room on the first floor, I immediately set about unpacking my belongings. I separated my clothes from my Stevensons and organized my military MRE, meals, tape recorder, camera, and recording devices meticulously. This arrangement ensured easy access to my equipment as I embarked on my journey. Kim Huong, a middle-aged woman whose beauty had faded over the years during her time in a forced labor camp, was now the proud owner of the hotel. She had been a former South Vietnamese movie star, and she insisted on sharing one of her films with me, which she playfully referred to as a sexy. In my mind, it would have probably been rated as PG. With great enthusiasm, she set up a large movie projector, loaded 2 reels, and commenced screening her movie. As the film played, she recounted her tumultuous journey. After the fall of Saigon, she had buried all her gold behind her house. However, her life took a drastic turn when she was arrested and sent to prison or a labor camp for reasons she couldn't fathom. She suspected it was because she owned a beautiful home that a North Vietnamese officer coveted. One of her former employees, who had worked at her residence, had become the mistress of this VC officer. Kim Huong believed that the girl had spied on her and discovered the gold hidden in her backyard. Eventually, she was released from the labor camp and became romantically involved with the VC official. Strangely, he met an untimely demise, and she used his resources to acquire the hotel. Comparing her appearance in her movies from 2 decades ago to her present self, it was evident that life had not been kind to her after her incarceration in the labor camp. While engrossed in Kim Huong's movie, my James dispatched one of her brothers to locate Miss Stevenson's younger sibling and escort him to my hotel. The man's name was Mr. Dung. To my disappointment, Mr. Dung did not comprehend or speak English, despite our prior written correspondence. It became apparent that someone else had composed the letters on his behalf. In an attempt to express my gratitude, I handed him $5 and conveyed my thanks. I also suggested that he remain close, as there might be potential tasks or opportunities I could involve him in. A later time, during this interview with Mr. Dung, Mrs. James was present, and she expressed her frustration with him for allowing me to believe he could speak English. She made it clear that she intended to find someone else for the task. Subsequently, Mr. Heap, a former Vietnamese interpreter and soldier who had served in the South Vietnamese Army, stepped in. He happened to be the neighbor of the man my James had hired to drive me around in his van. As I sat down with Mr. Heap, my James by my side, I explained that I was a tourist and shared a list of cities and places I wished to explore. I showed him my copy of the Lonely Planet travel book, which highlighted various tourist attractions in Vietnam. Additionally, I had brought a recently published book by the former Vietnam War news commentator Maury Schaefer titled The Flashbacks, which I had read in its entirety during my flight to Vietnam and had taken notes on. Schaefer had returned from Vietnam just a few months prior after a 3-week tour, and I was keen on locating the individuals of interest he had mentioned in his book. I asked Mr. Dung to assist in locating 2 specific individuals for me, one being a former South Vietnamese officer who had endured 15 years in a communist concentration camp and was referenced in Schaefer's book. The first individual, the former South Vietnamese officer, resided in close proximity. The second person I sought was a woman named Tran Dinh, who, as a young girl, had saved numerous American lives. She had alerted us to the presence of a placed mine under some sandbags while we were loading those bags onto a truck near the airport back in July 1968. This particular incident occurred during a work assignment I had received in my initial week in Vietnam while awaiting placement within a unit. Our task involved filling several sandbags near the airport, and one soldier had been left behind to guard the sandbags against theft while the rest of us departed for a meal at the mess hall. The guard we had left behind became distracted by a group of young women and children selling trinkets. Unfortunately, he failed to notice an individual in civilian attire surreptitiously placing a mine beneath a sandbag. The mine was rigged in such a way that lifting the bag would trigger a bouncing Betty explosive mine. Upon our return from lunch, we brought the guard a sack lunch along with a carton of milk. We resumed filling sandbags, while others began loading the filled bags onto the truck. Suddenly, a young girl, aged about 9 or 10, carrying a large, clear plastic bag or purse, pointed towards the mine and screamed, "Is he in?" One of the guys shouted for someone to grab her, and I managed to catch hold of her purse, but she wriggled free and dashed away, and no one pursued her. I examined the contents of the purse, finding tissue paper, a cloth napkin or a handkerchief, and a folded wallet containing the girl's ID card. I carefully took the ID card and placed it into my pocket, preserving it as a memento of that momentous day. The MPS were alerted, and the explosive ordnance disposal team swiftly arrived on the scene. We were instructed to vacate the area, leaving behind both the filled and empty bags. Now, 22 years later, I found myself in Saigon searching for a young girl named Tran Dinh. Mrs. Mai James sat closely beside me, to the point where it might have appeared as though we were a married couple. She candidly asked if I were affiliated with the CIA. I quickly denied any connection, but she scrutinized me with her gaze, expressing her curiosity about my potential ties to a government agency and the reasons behind my quest to locate these individuals. It seemed as though my true purpose may have been glaringly evident, prompting a Vietnamese-American woman to inquire if I had CIA affiliations. I explained that I had read a book during my flight and simply wished to find the man mentioned in the book. As for the woman, she was just someone I had been asked by a Vietnamese friend in the U.S. to contact with. Later, Mr. Dung returned and informed Mr. Heap that Tran Dinh's old ID card had an address, but it was proving challenging to locate because the street names from 1968 had changed over time. The government had assigned new names to the streets, often naming them after North Vietnamese heroes. Mr. Heap suggested that he knew a policeman who also worked as a detective and could potentially track down this woman. However, I declined the offer, expressing my reluctance to involve the police in my affairs. Mr. Heap then requested permission to make a photocopy of the old Vietnamese ID card. I agreed and provided him with a copy. In a city like Saigon, there seemed to be a photocopy machine and a place to send fax letters on nearly every block, making this task relatively straightforward. He later returned the copy to me. Later that day, Mai James introduced me to Mr. Leon, the owner of a 16-passenger van available for rent. I provided him with my itinerary, and he quoted a fee of $400 for the duration of my stay in Saigon, which I agreed to. Mr. Heap returned with news that he couldn't locate the street and had to enlist the help of a former police detective who was not associated with the VC. I concurred with this approach and spoke with the detective, explaining that a friend in the United States was eager to reconnect with this woman's family as they hadn't seen her in over 15 years. Mai James inquired whether I wanted to exchange my US dollars for Vietnamese dong. I handed her $200 US dollars and mentioned that I intended to keep the money in my wallet or backpack. She chuckled, pointing out that the largest denomination of paper money in Vietnam was 5000 dong, equivalent to less than 50 cents. She advised me to also carry smaller bills, as some merchants might struggle to provide change for larger denominations. I gave her a crisp, new $100 bill, knowing that the new currency would fetch a better exchange rate on the black market than used bills. Shortly thereafter, Mai's brother returned with an old, tall paper grocery bag filled to the brim with Vietnamese currency. She cautioned me to be discreet, as someone might attempt to steal. Simultaneously, Mr. Heap arrived and informed me that it would cost $100 US dollars to locate Miss Dinh. After some negotiation, we settled on 35 of in money, reaching a mutually acceptable agreement. On the second day in Vietnam, Mr. Heap remained close by my side, acting as my spokesperson. Mr. Dung returned with news that he had met several people who had crossed paths with Mr. Marty Schaefer, but none of them were familiar with the former South Vietnamese officer mentioned in Schaefer's book. They had even visited the house listed in Schaefer's book, but the officer remained unknown. Later, I had the chance to meet Mr. Marty Schaefer's travel guide and interpreter. He divulged that Mr. Schaefer had been more focused on seeking out acquaintances from his wartime days, particularly women. This had become somewhat of a running joke among others assigned to the Schaefer group by the Vietnamese government. They spent considerable time searching for these women and did manage to locate a few for him. They were all former prostitutes. He guide went on to reveal that Mr. Schaefer never actually visited many of the places he claimed to have in his book. Instead, he would inquire about these locations and jot down stories relayed to him. Schaefer's sole interest seemed to be finding these women, and they even found a very young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, who frequently accompanied his group. The female was spotted exiting Mr. Schaefer's room in the early morning hours. It appeared that Schaefer might not have been informed about the woman behind closed doors rule or had simply arranged things to look the other way by offering the right tip. I retrieved Schaefer's book, where I had underlined numerous passages, and learned that some of the details Mr. Schaefer had written were inaccurate. It seemed he had fabricated certain stories for the sake of selling his book. Upon returning home, I penned an honest review highlighting Schaefer's falsehoods and partial truths, emphasizing that his work was intended solely for entertainment. Subsequently, the book was removed from Amazon, where my one-star review had garnered hundreds of comments. The review had received over 4,000 helpful or thumbs-up ratings from readers who appreciated my candid assessment. Mr. Heap informed me that Mr. Dung, my Stevenson's brother and my van driver, needed to visit Saigon Tourism to arrange my travel plans. Saigon Tourism requested $500 US dollars for their services, which covered the paperwork, while I would still be responsible for the expenses related to accommodations and transportation, whether by car, bus, or train. Essentially, they were handling the administrative aspects. I expressed my reluctance, explaining that I had an old National Geographic map featuring major roads and village names, along with my trusty Lonely Planet travel book. However, Mr. Heap insisted that I must use Saigon Tourism. I reluctantly agreed, but made it clear that I had already handled this matter. I emphasized that there was no need to bring it up again. Back in the United States, I had been told that I would require permission and documentation from Saigon Tourism to travel to these remote areas. My boss at the Fort Huachuca AZ Military Intelligence School was convinced that I wouldn't receive the necessary travel papers or permission for these excursions. He explicitly instructed me not to attempt such trips without official permission. However, he seemed to give me a mixed message, as he subtly indicated that I could try it anyway, essentially implying that I should break the law and deal with the consequences later, including potential imprisonment. In the same breath, he advised me that if I were apprehended and questioned, I should claim ignorance of the law. He also suggested carrying a few $100s as bribe money to offer officials, which, in most cases, could prove effective. It was a curious combination of receiving training and instructions while being told I couldn't do it, yet encouraged to try, as if I were the only person they knew who could perform such feats. Besides, in one of my letters of commendation from General Gen, he indicated I have the capability of accomplishing every mission given to me, even if it required walking on water. I was chosen for this mission in the United States because of my ability to overcome obstacles, no matter how challenging or seemingly impossible the task. However, now that I was in Vietnam, the rules had drastically changed. I received a stern warning: never be alone in a room with a Vietnamese woman with the door closed. Avoid taking a life unless it was absolutely necessary for my survival, and even then make it look like an accident or the work of someone else, preferably a dog. Furthermore, I was strictly cautioned against getting involved in any Vietnamese affairs. The Vietnamese government set traps to ensnare foreigners, attempting to catch them in compromising situations with prostitutes or even local girlfriends. If caught, they would confiscate all your money and personal belongings, imposing house arrest as the only punishment. All that would remain were the clothes on your back and your plane ticket back home. Meanwhile, the female involved would face a year of forced labor in a camp. Mr. Leon, the van owner, approached me with concerning news. He informed me that the police wanted to assign officers to accompany me during my stay in Saigon, and I was expected to pay $23 per day for their services. Naturally, I questioned the purpose of this fee. I asked, "What is the money for?" To which he replied, "It's for protection and to ensure you don't go searching for live American Mies." I was taken aback by this demand and retorted, "Tell the police I don't need protection. And how could I possibly search for American MIs when both our countries have already declared there are none?" Mr. Leon left to convey my message to the police, but returned with unsettling news. He explained that the police were adamant about their demand, stating that if I refused to pay, I would not be allowed to leave my hotel. Frustrated, I suggested we go together to speak with the police directly, but Mr. Leon cautioned against it, warning that confronting the police might lead to house arrest until the day of my departure from Vietnam. I handed Mr. Leon $150 US and instructed him to give it to the police officer. We arranged to meet the policeman escort at 7 a.m. in front of the Prince's Hotel in downtown Saigon on the specified date. It's worth noting that using the term Saigon instead of a Chi Minh city can be a sensitive issue in Vietnam, especially among those who worked for the government in the city. With my departure from Saigon approaching, I had a few tasks to complete. One day, we visited a market in the downtown area called the Ban Thanh Market. While there, I encountered a woman with a deformed child who approached me, pointed to the child, and extended her hand, indicating she wanted money. I turned to Mr. Heap to ask if this was genuine, and he explained that he wasn't sure, but he believed that some children might be kidnapped or rented to beg for money, making it a lucrative scheme. Throughout my travels, I encountered numerous beggars, many of whom were covered in sores or displayed bleeding wounds, either on themselves or their children, as they stretched out their hands, pleading for money. On any typical day in Saigon or Da Nang, it was not uncommon for me to encounter 20 or more beggars of this kind. Years later, a Taiwanese TV special shed light on the situation, revealing that the majority of these beggars had either purchased the children or had them kidnapped as a means to exploit foreigners for money. This revelation made me cautious about whom I chose to assist, and I typically gave to those who did not directly ask for help. Most of these beggars were elderly women in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, carrying infants on their hips. It was a rare sight to see a younger woman with a child among them. I tended to be more inclined to believe and support younger women with children. I followed the advice to offer them some of my small notes, typically around 5 US cents, as this amount could buy them a modest lunch. In Saigon, you could find affordable meals priced at 500 dong, as long as you ventured off the main streets and explored the smaller side streets, where countless homes served dishes like noodles or rice soup for that price. Now, I wanted to exchange 500 US dollars with the van driver to receive Vietnamese dong, which gave me a total of 700 US dollars in cash. I did not want to be converting money all the time. Mr. Dung had already taken all of my Stevenson's clothes, leaving plenty of room in my duffel bags for the paper money. At that time, the highest denomination of paper money was the 5000 dong no. The driver brought me 2 paper sacks similar to old grocery bags, filled to the top. He handed me 300 US dollars back, explaining that it might be challenging for me to travel with so much money. With my Stevenson's clothes gone, I now had ample space in my bags. I possessed enough money to last me at least 2 weeks if I refrained from purchasing wartime souvenirs. To cater to my desires, and potentially those of my veteran friends, and to maintain the appearance of a genuine tourist, I frequently asked Vietnamese men I encountered if they had or knew someone who might possess old South Vietnamese or American insignia. I began collecting these items. We explored the city from the comfort of our van, visiting some of the historical buildings and areas. Although we only observed them from the street, we passed by former renowned hotels, the old American embassy, and the presidential palace. It was noticeable that if you looked Asian, you could enter these places, while Caucasians had to pay an entrance fee. I ventured to the former Tu Du Street, now known as Dong Quai, which had once been famous for its bars, brothels, and adult entertainment during the war. Although I had never been there before, I had heard countless stories and read about the area. Nowadays, it was just another neglected part of Saigon, in need of a fresh coat of paint. Mr. Heap had his preferred dining places, and he insisted on eating 3 times a day, whereas I was content with just 1 or 2 MRE meals daily. I would join the driver and Mr. Heap at their table, but preferred to consume my American Army meals. I paid for their meals and ordered an unopened can of soda, which I inspected carefully before consuming. I was a bit paranoid about drinking anything from an open container, always ensuring that everything I consumed was sealed. Mr. Heap would occasionally laugh, telling me that no one was going to drug me. However, I was simply following my training, not drinking water unless it was boiled or came from sealed containers. I had been warned that being drugged was a common occurrence, especially at night and in areas associated with prostitution, where individuals could be robbed, harmed, and made to disappear. Of course, I had no intention of going to those places at night unless my mission required it. Still, I took precautions. I paid for the meal and couldn't help but notice that the shop owner always slipped a little money to Mr. Heap after I had settled the bill. It was evident that Mr. Heap was receiving a kickback every time I made a purchase. This was something I made a mental note of, utilizing my Sherlock Holmes training initially. I sat in the front seat of the van, riding shotgun, and it felt like motorcycles and pushcarts were swarming around us, driving recklessly with near misses happening every few seconds. I was genuinely concerned that we might accidentally hit and injure someone. I turned to Mr. Heap and told him to inform the driver that if he were to hit someone, I wouldn't be giving him a tip. The driver just left, seemingly unfazed by the chaotic driving conditions. Mr. Heap explained that this was the norm, to which I replied, "Not in my country." I quickly realized that if I stayed in the front seat, I'd become a nervous wreck in no time. So I decided to move to the seat directly behind the driver. It was still a bit nerve-wracking, but nowhere near as terrifying as the front seat, where I felt the need to brace myself against the dashboard every 10 seconds. An American woman named Janet Siebel, riding on a Honda motorcycle, arrived at the Kim Huong Hotel in search of an American named Rogers. She had been informed that he would be staying at this mini hotel, or one with a similar name, and she had a message for him. We sat in the lobby and engaged in conversation. Janet explained that she worked in Saigon for a company based in the Philippines but stationed in Saigon. Her company's interests revolved around oil, inexpensive labor, and trade. She handed me her business card, which featured her phone and fax numbers in Saigon. She shared that she had been working in Saigon for approximately 6 months and offered to provide me with some tips on surviving in the country, to which I agreed. I was puzzled by why she was investing so much time in talking to me, especially since I was not the Mr. Rogers she was looking for. Nevertheless, she seemed eager to share insights about dealing with the secret police, navigating the landscape of bribes, and effectively using fax communications. Janet emphasized that Vietnam heavily relied on fax machines rather than phones, and that there were photocopy and fax machines available on nearly every street corner. She cautioned me to exercise caution, as authorities might want to retain copies of any fax I sent or received. Her advice included ensuring that I was present at the fax machine when sending the document and retrieving the original copy as soon as it was transmitted. She assured me that if my vehicle were to break down during my travels or if I required assistance from an American who spoke Vietnamese and French, I could reach out to her, and she would do her best to provide support. Interestingly, she then mentioned that if the nature of my message to her was such that it needed to be kept a secret from the Vietnamese government, I should send a fax with fabricated details about our interaction. In response, she would send a similarly fabricated fax back to me, signifying that it was indeed her on the other end. This code would indicate that I could then transmit my confidential message, knowing it had reached her and not fallen into the wrong hands. Janet clarified that the fax machine belonged to her but was accessible to others in her office. Additionally, she cautioned me about the ease of tapping hotel phones and advised that any discussion should remain strictly personal to ensure privacy. All sorts of alarms and red flags were going off in my mind, and I found myself questioning why I would ever need to send a secret message to her. In an attempt to steer the conversation away from secrecy, I asked if she was married. Janet replied with a firm no, but she did mention that she was currently in a relationship with her boss, a man named Robert. She added that it wasn't a happy relationship and that she planned to break up with him soon. I wondered why she felt compelled to share this personal information with me. Janet then explained that it was relatively easy to obtain a phone in Saigon, though the service quality was lacking unless you were in major cities. She inquired about my travel plans, to which I responded that I was simply touring the city and the country, visiting a few places where I had lived during the war. Janet cautioned me to be careful, particularly in Hanoi, as she believed there was a strong dislike for Americans there. Curiously, our conversation took an unexpected turn when she disclosed that she had grown up just outside of Langley, Virginia, and had attended school there. I couldn't help but find it intriguing since I had also taken a course in Langley, although I didn't disclose the details of who had sent me to that school. Janet extended an invitation for dinner at the Rex Hotel and suggested enjoying an American-style cheeseburger and fries, a rarity in the city. While it appeared to be a friendly gesture between two Americans who had connections to Langley, I couldn't help but feel there was more to her than met the eye. Could my mission somehow be linked to the CIA? These thoughts swirled in my mind as I agreed to meet her for dinner. During our dinner, Janet inquired if I remembered the message she had for Mr. Rogers that afternoon. I affirmed that I did recall it. She then handed me a fax message received from an individual in St. Louis. The message stated that this lady would assist me if I required help. This confirmation only deepened my suspicion that Janet was part of some larger network, but I couldn't completely trust her. After all, I had been trained never to place full trust in anyone. During our cheeseburger meal, Janet shared her dissatisfaction with her boyfriend, expressing her desire for a super spy as a replacement. I laughed and assured her that I was not a spy. Questions swirled in my mind. Why had they sent me to Vietnam when there seemed to be someone already in place to handle the task? I probed further, asking if she knew anyone I might be acquainted with, but she drew a blank. Janet, a striking woman who looked much younger than her 25 years, remained steadfast in her refusal to let me take her photograph. She insisted that she only knew of my arrival in Vietnam as a tourist, tasked with gathering information about me. Janet continued with her charade, reassuring me that she knew I was just a tourist. She recounted the story of how we had supposedly become friends when she was searching for a lost colleague of hers at the airport. According to her tale, the driver had dropped him off at a hotel in the district where she had stumbled upon me. She slyly winked at me, signaling that this was the story I should remember if questioned. Over time, I would come to realize that Janet was exceptionally intelligent, and this was all an act. At this moment, however, she was playing the part of A young woman seemingly unaware of the world's complexities. I couldn't help but appreciate a woman who could effortlessly play the role of the ingenue while being sharp as attack in reality. As we enjoyed our meal of 2 cheeseburgers and an order of fries, Vietnam style, I couldn't help but wonder if Janet was indeed who she claimed to be. She had delivered a message to me from someone I had last spoken to on the phone before departing from the U.S., which lent credibility to her story. However, my training had ingrained in me a healthy skepticism about trusting what people said, yet I reminded myself that this was general training. Over the course of our conversation, which stretched for more than 2 hours, I observed her body language closely. She portrayed herself as a young woman seemingly bored with life and in search of adventure. She regaled me with stories of her life experiences that were so diverse that less than 1% of American women would even consider them. She mentioned being a private pilot, engaging in scuba diving, including cave exploration, holding a parachutist certification, participating in mountain climbing, being a member of a gun club, and once working as a registered nurse. As I listened, I couldn't shake the feeling that Janet might have ties to the CIA. However, she carried herself like any other woman, often sounding like a high school student in casual conversation, except for those occasional moments when she displayed a startling level of intelligence. Janet was still somewhat of a mystery to me. Her eagerness to embark on a romantic adventure with a man she barely knew raised questions in my mind. My training kicked in, and I couldn't help but wonder whether she was genuinely seeking romance or if there was an ulterior motive, like gathering information. During my training, we learned about the tactics used during World War II, where many women had engaged in relationships with German officers to obtain valuable information that could be used to eliminate the officers or sabotage other critical targets within the German regime. These historical parallels swirled through my thoughts, and I found myself pondering countless questions. While part of me wanted to believe everything Janet told me, I couldn't help but remain cautious, keeping a watchful eye on my surroundings. Could I trust her completely, or was there a possibility that she had ties to the secret police or perhaps even the Soviet authorities? I had received extensive training in the U.S., emphasizing the importance of always being vigilant, especially when it came to women bearing gifts of themselves. She proposed a miniature of Saigon for the following day, and I agreed. We arranged to meet in front of my hotel, where she arrived in a cyclo-taxi Zich Lo. This unique vehicle is a 3-wheel bicycle cart with 2 wheels in the front, a driver position in the rear, and a seat up front for passengers or multiple individuals if they were small in size. While it was designed for one person, it wasn't uncommon to see 3 or 4 passengers squeeze into the front seat. Janet suggested that we explore the city in a cycle, but I explained that I had already hired a chauffeured van for the duration of my stay in Saigon, which would be far more comfortable. However, she insisted that she preferred the excitement of riding in her cyclo. I suggested that I could rent another cyclo for about $5 for 3 or 4 hours to accommodate both of us comfortably. However, she firmly declined my offer, insisting that she wanted me to save money. Instead, she got out of her cycle and gestured for me to get in, taking a seat on my lap while leaning back beside me. Her white blouse was loosely fitted and unbuttoned at the top, and I made a conscious effort to avoid looking down at her cleavage as I sat behind her. While she claimed it was to save me money, I couldn't help but think she might have had another reason for wanting to sit so close to me. She smelled delightful, and I found myself chuckling a few times as she bounced up and down on my lap due to the uneven road. Even though I was no longer a teenager, her movements had a certain effect on me. She led me to the main Catholic church, and we entered. I decided to say a prayer and made the sign of the cross. She asked if I was worried about my safety while traveling in Vietnam. I replied that my concerns weren't about my safety, but rather about other parts of my anatomy when she was riding on my lap and bouncing up and down. She looked at me, chuckled, and playfully tapped my cheek. Afterward, she shifted her position, sitting more to my right side and on my leg instead of my lap, asking if that was better. I realized I had made a mistake by mentioning it. For the rest of the day, she would periodically turn and give me a mischievous smile, then burst into laughter, always trying to conceal it. She was clearly enjoying my embarrassment. After 2 hours of her guided tour, she turned to me and confessed that she had a boyfriend at her company, and they had been together for about 6 months. However, she admitted that she had more fun with me in just 2 hours than she had with Robert in half a year. I couldn't help but think back to those stories of women during WWI and wonder what they did to captivate those men and become their mistresses. The next day, as I prepared to depart, my driver took us to downtown Saigon and the Prince's Hotel, where we were supposed to meet the policeman who would accompany us. I instructed Heap to convey to the driver, as we passed by the front of the hotel, that if the policeman wasn't there on time, we would leave without him. Mr. Heap relayed my message, and the driver gave him a quizzical double-take, then turned to look at me and burst into laughter. There were people milling about in front of the hotel, but I had no way of identifying the policeman among them, nor did I have the patience to approach each person and inquire. My stance was clear. If he wasn't punctual, I wasn't going to waste my time waiting. The driver kept laughing and shaking his head in amusement. We hadn't been on the road for even 30 minutes when the van suddenly sputtered to a halt. The driver crawled beneath the vehicle to inspect the fuel filter and managed to fix it. We resumed our journey, but an hour later, he had to repeat the repair. The dirt roads in Vietnam were riddled with potholes that would make World War II veterans from the Battle of the Bulge envious. They were like foxholes in size. Many of these potholes were filled with water, and their depths were so substantial that I feared muddy water might seep into the vehicle. These potholes were enormous, large enough to accommodate an entire platoon of soldiers who could stand up and remain concealed from attackers. Due to these treacherous road conditions, our maximum speed rarely exceeded 20 kilometers per hour, and sometimes it was halved after heavy rainfall when the potholes filled with water. We cautiously navigated around them, unsure of their depths. Occasionally, we'd come to a complete stop when we encountered a 30-foot stretch of water on the road, and the driver hesitated, fearing that driving through it would submerge us. In such cases, we waited until a massive 5-ton truck crossed the waterhole first. Sometimes even these large trucks would venture into a pothole, with the water rising above their tires. When that happened, we had to either find an alternative route or carefully drive along the roadside to bypass it. On occasion, villagers would notice us stopped and kindly point us toward one side of the road or an alternate route where the water was shallow. Many of the village streets we traversed were caked in mud, bearing ruts a foot deep from the heavy traffic of motorbikes. As we entered these villages, I rolled down the window and waved to the people in the shops along the street. Their faces lit up with excitement when they saw me, an American. I'm quite certain they recognized me as an American, as the Russians were the only other white foreigners in the country, and they were neither friendly nor inclined to wave at you. The Russians were often referred to as Americans without money. We were moving at a slow enough pace that some women would scoop up their infant children, point towards me as the American, and have their little ones wave back. In my journal later, I noted that I had never received a welcome home from anyone in the U.S. when I returned in 1969, but in Vietnam in 1990, I certainly did. I reflect on my homecoming in September 1969 when I had just landed at St. Louis Airport. As I disembarked, I was met by a group of striking teenage girls with wide, round eyes, donning bell-bottom pants, and sporting long, straight hippie-style hair. One of the girls approached me, noticing the purple and white ribbon on my chest that signified I had been wounded in Vietnam. She asked if I had been wounded, and I replied affirmatively. In a heartless remark, she said, "It's a shame they didn't kill you." As we traversed Highway 1, I couldn't help but notice the numerous old U.S. Army trucks with 55-gallon barrels perched atop their cabs, meant for water storage. Most of these trucks had malfunctioning water pumps, so water flowed down a tube from the barrels on the truck's roof, feeding into the engine and spewing out scalding water onto the center of the road. It was crucial to keep your window rolled up to avoid getting doused with the warm water. During our journey, I also witnessed a multitude of farm rotor tillers. These tillers had been provided by the U.S. government to South Vietnamese farmers as replacements for oxen. However, the resourceful Vietnamese had repurposed these tillers into farm tractors, using them to pull wagons loaded with baskets of rice. I even spotted one that had been transformed into a 6-passenger bus. It struck me how all the equipment we had left behind was now serving entirely different functions than originally intended. The Vietnamese people's ingenuity was truly remarkable, as they could take what might seem like junk and turn it into a valuable tool. On our way to the mountain city of Da Lat, I was informed that, for an unknown reason, I was prohibited from entering the city as an American. We made a stop along the road, and my driver kindly procured a maple leaf collar pin for me, indicating that I was from Canada. Further along the route, we arrived at a recently constructed wooden restaurant. Situated about 10 to 20 kilometers from any town or notable business, we decided to have lunch there, and afterward, I took a stroll down to the swiftly flowing river located behind the restaurant. As I returned, I noticed a hill nearby that appeared to be earmarked for a future local wildlife zoo. Upon re-entering the restaurant, I encountered a group of Vietnamese military soldiers. The building was open air, with no glass in the windows at the front. Simultaneously, outside in the parking lot, I counted at least 100 soldiers, with some of them carrying rifles. The officers approached our table and inquired whether I was an American. However, my driver swiftly intervened, stating that I was, in fact, from Canada, and he displayed my maple leaf lapel pin on my collar. The officers then explained, displaying a mean and hateful face, that Americans were not permitted to enter Da Lat. I had heard stories, not sure if they were true, but the stories were that there were nuclear rods in Dalat to be used for some type of reactor, and after our departure from the country, those rods had been removed and lay on the ground. The driver confidently affirmed that I was from Canada. However, the officers continued to scrutinize me and initiated a conversation in rudimentary English, discussing how they had encountered and engaged many Americans during the war and killed them, punctuating their conversation with laughter. Feeling uncomfortable, we decided it was best to leave. We rose from our seats and exited the restaurant, heading back to the van. As we were getting into the van, one of the officers emerged and positioned himself on the wraparound wooden porch at the front of the restaurant. He shouted at our driver, who was already in the vehicle, indicating that he wished to inspect my travel documents. Sensing potential trouble, the driver acted as if he hadn't heard the officer and swiftly drove away, leaving the officer gesturing and shaking his fist. I couldn't help but worry, wondering if the officer might use the available phone to alert authorities further down the road to intercept us. As twilight descended, we arrived in Dalat and decided to check into a hotel. Unfortunately, a mishap occurred when I inadvertently presented my American passport instead of the Canadian one at the first hotel we visited. The hotel owner, upon noticing my American passport, informed us that Americans were not permitted to stay in his establishment. Consequently, we continued down the road and stopped at a different hotel, where I promptly presented my Canadian passport. What I didn't realize at the time was that this second hotel was government-owned, and as such, they were obligated to inform the local police about a Canadian guest staying overnight. After settling into my room, we ventured into the nearby market. To access the market, we had to descend a steep flight of about 100 steps into a lower area on the hillside where the market was situated. Several hours later, we returned to the hotel. Upon entering my hotel room, I was taken aback to discover that it was in disarray. It became evident that the secret police had entered my room and conducted a thorough search. Concerned about this intrusion, I approached the hotel owner for an explanation. He revealed that the authorities had discovered my American passport, and it was imperative for me to go and speak with the police. We immediately headed to the police department, only to find it closed at that time. Later that night, a visit from the police added to the unfolding drama. They were curious about the presence of both an American and a Canadian passport in my possession. I explained to them that I held dual citizenship, with my father being French and residing in Canada, while my mother was American. This explanation, facilitated by Mr. Heap's translation skills during our hour-long conversation, appeared to satisfy their initial concerns. Nevertheless, they requested that I visit the police department in the morning to sign some documents. My American passport was returned to me at that moment, but the Canadian one remained in the hotel's possession. The next morning, I attempted to retrieve my Canadian passport from the hotel, but the clerk informed me that the police had taken it the previous day. This turn of events left me with only the American passport, which the police had returned. Given that the hotel owner was aware of our intended destination, Duxec, and had even inquired about travel directions, I felt compelled to alter our plans. We decided to descend the mountainside and make our way to the city of Pham Thai. We settled the bill at the hotel, got into the van, and made our way out of that town, descending down the steep hillside towards the coastline. The road conditions were horrendous, turning what should have been a 2-hour journey into a day-long ordeal that lasted until nightfall. Relentless rain obscured our vision, making it challenging to navigate, and the driver had to stop every few miles to clean the van's fuel filter, sometimes while lying in the mud. Once we reached the flat terrain beyond a bridge, we had to stop again for more repairs. Mr. Heap went into a nearby bar, and I lost track of him. After searching for about 10 minutes, I finally found him reclining in a hammock with a woman whose hands were down the front of his pants. I urged him that we needed to leave, and I suggested stopping in Pham Thai, which was only about 20 miles away. He was reluctant to depart and asked for 10 more minutes, which stretched into half an hour or more before we finally resumed our journey to the coastal city of Pham Thai, where we stopped at a coffee shop. As we stopped on the corner, I noticed an elderly woman cradling a child with a deformed foot. The moment she spotted me, she hurried over, gesturing towards her child's foot and then motioning for me to give her money. The shop owner spoke English and explained that the child had been rented from a family, and it was the same old woman but with a different child each time. When you gave money to these elderly women, the child received nothing, and if there was a family involved, they received a small amount of money for lending their child and providing daytime care while they worked in the rice fields. This was a common sight in the big cities, occurring almost daily, but less so in the smaller towns and countryside where I encounter more traditional beggars. On another occasion, we stopped for lunch, and an old woman spotted me getting out of the van She dashed across the street to a nearby house and emerged with a child who had a missing leg. They assumed I was blind, so they pointed to the child's disability, showcasing it, and then extending their hand for me to place money in it. Despite the late hour, many shops were still open in the vicinity. I took a seat at the coffee shop and ordered a soda, immediately drawing the attention of the curious locals who seemed to pass by and stare. Among the people present was a woman named Dumai, known for selling lottery tickets and offering her services as a fortune teller. Her reputation was built on her ability to foresee events in people's futures. The tale behind her practice was that her brother, who had been a soldier in Cambodia, had tragically lost his life in 1975. It was said that if you asked her about your future, she would first gather information and then take it home, where she would say a prayer to her late brother. In a dream, either that night or at some point in the future, her brother would reveal what was going to happen. This was the premise of her so-called fortune-telling, but it came at a price. Clients would need to pay her a small fee upfront, and if she had a compelling story to share, they'd pay more for her to complete it. However, her responses were not immediate. The clients might have to wait for several days, weeks, or even months to receive an answer. Sometimes, they might not receive a response at all. The stories I heard spoke of predictions that had come true, ranging from events occurring within a few days to several months later. Years later, I would cross paths with Duma once more, and she continued to predict significant events in my life, including my second marriage and the arrival of 2 sons. Her uncanny accuracy left a lasting impression on me. On that particular day, she recounted a chilling story of a couple who had been granted asylum in the United States. They had been eagerly awaiting their departure for nearly 2 months, but when they consulted Dumai about their future, she delivered a stark and unsettling prediction. She told them that they would never make it to America, yet she refused to divulge the reasons behind her foreboding words. Disheartened by her response, the couple left her presence, only to meet a tragic end just 2 days later when a truck fatally struck them in the street. Another couple sought her guidance regarding the sex of their unborn child as the due date was fast approaching. Dumai informed them that they would have a girl, but advised them to head to the hospital for the birth. Unfortunately, circumstances prevented them from going to the hospital, and their child suffered medical complications and died. It could have been prevented if the mother had gone to the hospital. The parents had both been warned and failed to follow her suggestion. In yet another instance, a young couple inquired about the timing of their impending marriage. Dumai's response was grim, and she told them that they would never wed. Later, it became evident that the girl's family disapproved of her relationship with the young man and forced her into a marriage with a considerably older man solely because of his wealth. This wasn't the first time I had witnessed such a situation in Saigon, and the pattern seemed to persist in Pham Thiet as well. Forced marriages not for love but for money. As time went on, I would have more encounters with Dumai, and her predictions about my future would continue to unfold. Very late that evening, the driver scoured the area for a place to stay, eventually stopping at a house where some members of his family resided. The driver expressed concern for my well-being, fearing potential issues arising from not staying in a government-owned hotel. He engaged in a conversation with his family members, informing them that I was a Canadian. To my surprise, they began conversing with me in French. I stuck to the established cover story, reiterating the details. Later in the evening, someone arrived at the front door and spoke to the family. Mr. Heap explained that they had been informed that I needed to surrender my passport to the family, who would then deliver it to the police station. Initially, I feigned difficulty in locating the passport, but they kindly offered their assistance in searching through my belongings until we found it. At that time, I no longer possessed a fake passport, so I reluctantly handed over my American one, reasoning that the worst-case scenario would likely entail being asked to leave or paying a bribe. It was a stark reminder that I was not permitted to stay overnight in a Vietnamese household. The strict regulation mandated that only government-owned hotels were acceptable accommodations, and even there, I still had to surrender my passport for inspection by the authorities. Thankfully, the police station remained closed, sparing me from potential complications had they discovered my American passport. Such a situation could have entailed significant difficulties and substantial bribes, particularly given my lack of official travel documents. Additionally, some of the police officers were former members of the Viet Cong, BC, and their willingness to accept bribes was uncertain, making the situation even more precarious after the communist takeover in Vietnam. Strict restrictions were imposed on people's movement. Even travel into the next village, often just a few kilometers away, required individuals to check in with the police and sometimes pay bribes for travel documents. Informing others to the police was encouraged and rewarded, with informers receiving incentives like candy to the children informing on their parents. Children were even encouraged to report on their own parents, and those reported would be sent to economic zones, essentially forced labor camps. This practice, though waning, still persisted in some rural areas as late as 1990. I was deeply concerned that I might inadvertently cause problems for the family hosting me, so I suggested to Mr. Heath that I wouldn't mind staying in the van overnight. However, he reassured me not to worry about it. The family's youngest son, who appeared to be in his late 20s and spoke excellent English, began asking me a series of questions. I felt uncomfortable and pretended not to understand his inquiries, forcing Mr. Heap to translate. Exhausted, I eventually retired for the night, sleeping on the floor just outside the bathroom and shower area. When I woke up later to use the bathroom, I was shocked to find that the floor was covered with nearly an inch of water. I carefully stepped around to a drier area along the wall. It was at this moment that the young man, accompanied by his father, entered the bathroom and confronted me, directly asking who I was. Once more, I feigned ignorance and returned to bed. The driver and his family, however, were insistent that I join them for breakfast in town. At the restaurant, the younger man engaged me in English, with Mr. Heap providing translations for his flawless English. I couldn't help but feel that he knew the truth and that I was trying to protect them. He pointed to the nearby airport, expressing his admiration for Americans and revealing that he worked at the airport. He even thanked me for my service as a soldier before, and I continued to pretend not to comprehend. After we left the restaurant and resumed our journey, Mr. Heap confided that he believed these people were aware of my true nationality but chose to go along with our fabricated story. Before parting ways, they provided me with an address and handed me a letter asking if I would send it to their family in Canada once I returned home. We were back on the road again. Now my current travels were taking a place near Duckpack as my mind races back to 1960. I was with Lieutenant Hockenberry at that time, and we engaged in trading LRRP, long-range reconnaissance patrol, food rations with the Special Forces in exchange for captured guns in the Duckpack area. Around 1993, I managed to locate Lieutenant Hockenberry, told him I had recently traveled there, and shared my suspicion that he had been involved in the black market, trading guns intended to be sold as war trophies to rear echelon soldiers for their return home. He defended himself, claiming that he had used shotguns for infantry soldiers on point duty in the field. I recalled an incident where he had traded 20 cases of C rations for 2 girls to spend the night with him on Hill 54. He remained tight-lipped about that particular episode. For more information regarding that story, read September 24, 1968, in my daily journal referred to as LOM Land of the Midnight Scream. Once again, I showed Mr. Heap a highly detailed map, originally from National Geographic magazine in 1963, featuring highways and villages. I pointed out my intended destination and discussed our travel plans with Mr. Heap and the driver. We devised a route using major roads to reach the village I needed to visit, keeping in mind that some villages had been destroyed and some roads had been abandoned over the years. Unbeknownst to me, Mr. Heap had given my driver instructions to take us to a remote town to visit one of his old girlfriends. As evening approached, we arrived at a modestly sized village and stopped at a somewhat rundown hotel. I inquired about our location on my trusty National Geographic map, which was our primary navigational resource at the time. Mr. Heap responded that he couldn't find the town listed on the map, explaining that the VC had changed the names of many South Vietnamese cities after 1975. I showed the map to the driver, prompting Mr. Heap to quickly say something in Vietnamese to the driver, which gave me the sense that he was attempting to conceal our actual location. The driver glanced at Mr. Heap and then back at me, pointing to the city's location on my map, which was significantly off our planned route. Puzzled, I asked Mr. Heap why he had taken us so far away from our intended path. He mentioned that it was getting late, and he was uncertain we would find accommodation along the planned route since he believed there were no hotels. He assured me that he knew this village had a hotel because he had lived there during the war. He also added that the police frequently patrolled the route we had initially planned to use, whereas this hotel would be off their beaten path and unlikely to cause any issues. Though I accepted his explanation at that moment, I emphasized the importance of informing me when making changes to our travel plans going forward. We drove through a set of double gates into the hotel plaza, and the gates were promptly closed behind us, creating a sense of confinement, almost like entering a prison. This plaza was likely used for events such as weddings or parties, but wasn't designed for parking vehicles. Leaving the van unattended outside a locked gate anywhere in Vietnam posed a significant risk of theft during the night, either of the vehicle itself or its valuable contents. The room cost around $1.50 per night for both Mr. Heap and me, sharing the same room as usual, with the driver receiving complimentary lodging for transporting me to this hotel. The hotel had a U-shaped layout, with the front featuring a 10-foot wall and a central gate. All the rooms were located on the second floor, accessible via an open walkway surrounding the U-shaped building, offering a view down into the courtyard below. As I gazed down from the balcony into the courtyard, I could see the driver underneath the van, working diligently to repair whatever was causing the van to break down every 10 or 15 miles. When I turned around, I faced the room's forks window. It lacked glass but had two large, green, wood-louvered shutters that could be closed to seal off the room. Additionally, there was an overhanging roof that protected the room from rain entering through the windows. Even with the wooden shutters closed, the room offered little privacy, as it would be relatively easy for someone to peer inside or attempt to enter. To the right of the window, there was a shutter-style door with a simple handle, reminiscent of doors in western towns from the 1870s. Adjacent to that was another smaller door. Mr. Heap opened the door for me, and as I entered, the driver brought my 2 bags and followed suit. Inside, I found 2 beds equipped with large mosquito nets that appeared to be repurposed from the former U.S. Army. These beds featured a rope stretched across the frame, serving as a makeshift mattress support. A sack filled with what seemed to be plant fibers served as a cushion of sorts. Initially, I sat on the mattress, then lay down, nearly vanishing into the bedding. I expressed my disbelief at the poor quality of the accommodations, but Mr. Heap seemed unperturbed. The room's walls were constructed from stone, and there was a shutter-style door with rubber tires used as hinges. The bathroom, located on the right, was a narrow room measuring 3 feet in width and 10 feet in depth. It featured an aging sink with a mirror fixed to the wall behind it. On the floor, there sat a yellow plastic bucket and a water spout, along with a hole in the floor. To ensure accuracy, there were 2 deep imprints for your feet, guiding you where to place them when using the toilet. This type of bathroom had been the standard in Vietnam since the mid-1700s. When I attempted to take a shower, I was greeted only by the cold water supply. Inside the bathroom, there was also a pull cord that activated a small light bulb positioned above the mirror. As with most aspects of the room, privacy was essentially non-existent within the bathroom. Exhausted from the long day, I shed my street clothes and donned pajamas. I stretched out in the oppressive heat of the room, observing Mr. Heap as he got ready to go out. Curious about his plans, I inquired, and he mentioned that he had a friend residing in this town. After approximately 20 minutes, Mr. Heap returned and asked if I would be interested in meeting some of his acquaintances who were friends from before 1975. His motive was to encourage me to spend some money, allowing him to earn a tip. I complied, changing into a pair of shorts and a white t-shirt adorned with a logo, then followed him out onto the street. We made a left turn and wandered through the narrow alleyways, eventually becoming disoriented. Our journey led us to a nighttime establishment or club bustling with young men drinking, while a few girls attempted to persuade the patrons to spend more money on them and their beverages. As I entered the door, I became the center of attention. I was guided to a booth that was larger than the standard ones, featuring an oversized tabletop. It's somewhat difficult to describe, but one side of the booth had a wall extending all the way to the ceiling, with no seating available on that side. There was a rather peculiar seating arrangement at the club. There was 1 3 table, followed by a bench seat. When seated at the table, you were facing a wall adorned with a beer poster featuring a scantily clad Asian girl posing on her Honda motorcycle. I took the seat to the far right, pressed up against the wall, while Mr. Heap settled on the outer side. Shortly thereafter, 2 young girls appeared. The first one climbed up onto the tabletop, strolled across it, and seated herself between Mr. Heap and me, followed by the second girl, who sat next to Mr. Heap. The girl who sat next to me couldn't speak English, and while not particularly attractive, she wasn't unattractive either. She giggled frequently as she posed questions, which Mr. Heap translated for me. We placed our drink orders, but to keep a clear head, I opted for a soda. The girl introduced herself as Lian and explained that she worked at the club, with her role being to encourage patrons to buy more drinks and give her a tip in exchange for her company. Lian took hold of my hand and carefully examined my palm, pointing out each line and explaining what it signified. She mentioned something about me being a very romantic man, and how she had always wanted to meet someone romantic. She held my hand against her face, nuzzling it, then slowly moved it down over her chest, as if inviting me to squeeze. However, I refrained from doing so. After a minute, she boldly squeezed my hand against her breast, and I could feel the firmness of her nipple. She then moved her hand lower, between my legs, but I promptly moved her hand away, firmly saying no. Lian said something to Mr. Heap, who in turn informed me that she thought I was just shy with girls. I clarified that it wasn't shyness, but the fact that I was a married man. Mr. Heap inquired if I like her, and I replied that she was okay for conversation. but I wasn't interested in her in any other way beyond talking. After finishing my drink, I paid the bill and mentioned that I needed to get some rest. The girl, standing up on the bench seat, gracefully stepped onto the tabletop, hopped off, turned towards me, and planted 3 quick kisses on my face before departing. Curious about what he had said to her, I asked Heap. He explained that he had told her I like her but that I was married and wouldn't cheat. According to him, the girl believed I was just embarrassed to have a girl sit next to me, and now she might go find someone else, which he found quite amusing. A few minutes later, I was taken aback to discover the same girl underneath the table. She had slipped her hand up my shorts and was holding me in her grasp. The wall in front of us had an opening at the bottom that allowed someone to crawl under it, positioning themselves directly under the table and facing the person seated on the bench. I glanced on to see that it was indeed the same girl, and she seemed poised to go further. I pulled away and firmly said, No. Mr. Heap advised me to let her do her job and mentioned that she only charged around 1000 dom, and since no one could see her or me, it would be discreet. Despite her actions causing a significant reaction, I told Heap to convey to her that I'd pay her to stop. She ceased her advances, gave me a kiss, and accepted 1000 dong before leaving. Moments later, she returned, walking on the table and resuming her seat next to me, taking my hand and placing it on her breast once more. I took out my wallet and gave her another 1000 dong in Vietnamese currency. She kissed me on the cheek, and I informed Mr. Heap that I needed to return to my room and get some sleep, requesting directions. He suggested that the girl should accompany me. However, I wanted Mr. Heap to take me back to the hotel instead. He claimed it would be impolite for him to leave so soon and insisted that I let the girl escort me back. Despite my frustration with Mr. Heap, I knew I couldn't fire him and start all over again. The same girl walked beside me as we navigated the dark alley, illuminated by candlelight in the open doors and windows of the nearby houses. I attracted hard and disapproving stares from the men and women who were outside their shops or homes. Thea repeatedly reached her hand over to touch me, attempting to provoke another reaction. I stopped her, placed both hands on her shoulders, and sternly said, No, while maintaining an angry expression. When we arrived at the hotel, I knocked on the door to enter the plaza. I handed her another 1000 dom, and she put her hand down my pants, licking her lips as if hungry. I declined her advances, insisting that I had to leave, but she wanted to follow me upstairs. Just then, the door opened, and an older woman appeared, casting an angry gaze at Leon. The old woman began to argue with the girl, pushing her aside and closing the door. I gave the older woman a couple 5000 dong and made the hand motions of going upstairs and washing the girl off of me. The water was really cold, and while I was standing in the bathroom naked, the old woman opened the small entrance door from outside the room, which had no lock, and brought me a bucket of hot water. She pays no attention to my nakedness, as if she saw naked American men all the time. I'm facing the wall where she can only see my backside, and I'm thinking, is she never going to leave? She gives my butt a light slap and laughs. She is like a mother and turns me around even though I protest. She begins to wash me from the shoulders down in the warm water. I can't get rid of this erection, and she takes her hand and slaps my penis down as if saying she is not doing this for sex but as a service to me. The slap had little if any effect, and she did it twice more, then looked at it, and then up to me and smiled. Then she handed me one towel to hold as she dried me with another. Then, without warning, she picked up the empty hot water bucket and dirty towels and left the room. Outside, with the door still open, I saw 2 or 3 children looking at me, and they were giggling. A younger girl walked by my room but did not look in. Mr. Heap returned to the room an hour or more later, and I told him I never want to do that again. He nodded his head and climbed into his bed. Throughout the night I could feel the mosquitoes attacking me, finding their way through the mosquito netting. In the morning I had at least 50 bites on my face, shoulder, and arms. I was covered in bites. I wanted to take a shower, but the water was just too cold, so I just shaved and hand washed. I was worried the old woman would return and require me to stand still while she washed me. I walked out of the room to look down on the plaza, and there was some soft VN music playing. I turned to see the old woman from last night standing beside me with the bucket of hot water, pointing me to the bathroom where she could wash me again. I said no, shaking my head. She opened the bathroom side door, and Heap was standing in the room shaving. He was shocked, and she said something. She put the bucket down and walked away. I pulled out a couple 1000 dong notes and gave it to her for the warm water last night. She raised her maroon-colored blouse, opened the waistband of her black pants, and put the money inside and walked away. I looked back down into the plaza and saw the driver doing something to the van. I walked down to the plaza, and the old woman opened the door, and there stood the girl named Leon waiting for me, wanting to travel with us. I refused and Mr. Heap told me to take her photo. I took it, and then she wanted one of us together. She wrote her name and address on a piece of paper and put it in my pants pocket. I got into the van and told Mr. Heap again I never wanted to do that again. Don't lead me into a trap like that again or you will never work for me again. We left early the next morning, but only after Mr. Heap tried to introduce me to a young girl and her family. Not sure of his intentions, but I think the girl's family offered Mr. Heap money to introduce their daughter to me. She played a song on the piano and sang a song. I apologized, saying I was happy to meet them, but I needed to constitute my journey. Our journey continued. So here I was going back out into a bandit-infested area with just the driver, Hype, and me. It wasn't until we were 30 or more kilometers away that the vegetation increased across the ground, the road was more difficult to negotiate, and the people did not look or dress the same as they did elsewhere. These people looked dangerous, as if they would not have any problem whatsoever in robbing or killing you for the dollars in your pocket and the van you're driving in. 2 years later, I would hire military enlisted soldiers with guns to accompany me, the American who wanted to return to the area where he was once a soldier. Today I'm an American on vacation, and no one knew who I was other than the driver and Mr. Heap. Mr. Heap was not crazy about going into this area of the jungle. He hated the place back when he was a South Vietnamese soldier. A very dangerous area, as these mountain people hated the VC as much as they hated the South Vietnamese. I never thought about any of that. I only thought I had a mission, and this is what I had to do. On the last leg of this trip, we stopped for lunch, and the owner of the cafe told Mr. Heap that a Russian husband and wife tourist had been robbed and killed earlier that year, and she was warning us. Even the Vietnam government does not go into these areas unless heavily armed, and here I am, the white-skinned foreigner, driving down a jungle dirt road with heavy vegetation on both sides of the narrow roadway, while villagers carrying machetes were walking the other way, giving us angry looks. I was hoping that we would not continue to have problems with the fuel line. The driver has been stopping the van every few miles, getting underneath and removing the filter and cleaning it. This cleaning worked for another 30 minutes or so before we had to stop again. The driver thought he had found the real problem, and then we were able to drive. A few hours, and then at last I made it to the former Duxak Special Forces camp. I asked Mr. Heap to translate to the large crowd that had gathered around me. They speak a different dialect, so it was difficult to translate. I said back in 1967 I was a soldier here, and I remember there was a jet that had crashed somewhere out in the jungle. I would love to see the crash site and perhaps get a souvenir. I would pay 10 Vietnamese dollars, 10,000 dong, to anyone who would show me the location. 3 or 4 men pointed into the distance as if it was a long way off. Mr. Heap tells me it is about 5 kilometers away in the jungle and not easy to get there. I told Mr. Heap to offer them $30, 30,000 dong, for a guide. 2 men said they would take us, but we would have to drive. It's difficult to get my driver to continue driving in this jungle area. He is scared to death. The road was a small, narrow dirt and mud trail the width of a house's hallway or a motorcycle road wide. We drove until the road changed into a walking path. A couple of other men followed behind us on their Hondas, and they had machetes and began cutting down the jungle so the driver could turn the van around, but it wasn't long before he was under the van working on the fuel filter. We began to walk until we were stopped by 6 large men, each with a machete in their hands. Mr. Heap said these were bandits and we might be robbed. They wanted to know if I were a Soviet, and Mr. Heap said I know I was Canadian. Then Heap touched my shirt collar, showing the Canadian maple leaf that the driver bought for me when he thought we were going to have problems when in city of Dalat. It's worked a couple of times so far. They said they hated the Soviets and loved the Americans, and when Mr. Heap told them I was a Canadian who joined the American Army, they loved me. I guess I'm going to have to remember who I am, depending where I'm at that time. I told Mr. Heap I had to remain Canadian, and I was no longer using a State Department-issued fake Canadian passport. Mr. Heap asked me how I got a fake passport, and I just said it is easy to get one. You can easily find blank ones in almost any company that sells stationery in the U.S. I did not want to tell him the truth, but he just raised his eyebrows and accepted it as a truth. You can have them made in Vietnam, I said, so why not the same in the United States? I offered these men extra money if they could help me find the crash site. It's getting expensive, and I'm throwing money around, and at some point they might just think, why don't we take all that I have and cut my throat? They knew where the plane had crashed, and they went on to say they said they found 2 bodies there and buried them many years ago. I only have listed 1 American, not sure whom the others belong to. Maybe someone the pilot killed before they killed him. Another 2 hours chopping down razor grass until we found broken parts of an aircraft. I picked up a piece of metal with a serial number on it and stuck it in my bag. They said they buried the bodies somewhere around here, but they had forgotten, and the jungle had reclaimed this land many years ago. I entered the log and led into my GPS and saved it. I took a sample of the soil and put it in a gray-colored plastic bag with a zipper closure and placed it in my pack. I told them someone else would come to get the bodies, not me. We all walked back to the van taking a different route and following a stream when we found the driver fast asleep under a tree. My heap wanted to scare him, and he did. The driver did not appreciate the humor. These villagers wanted to make lunch for me, and I said it was not necessary. Mr. Heap said they insisted, and it would be impolite not to take their meal. Mr. Heap says one of the bandits said the VC doesn't come out here or they will lose their head, and the Soviets the same thing. One of them accused me of being Soviet, and now I needed to worry. I denied it, saying I once worked with the American here in this area when the Special Forces also lived here. One of them said he knew me from the war. He asked if I was Peter, and I said no, I was Michael, a name I used during the war to cover my identity in case I got into trouble when dealing in the black market. I'm thinking I'm getting myself in too deep with these people, and I needed to get out of Dodge City as soon as possible before I get caught up in a lie. He said something to another man, and then another older man appeared and asked if I remember him. His name was forgotten. I said no, but he said he remembered Michael from the war and that they had worked during the war. He asked if I had ever been to this village before. Of course I said yes back in 1968 when there were VC heads posted on metal fence posts around the bottom of this hilltop. I was thinking this might help me establish a friendship where they did not think I was a Soviet. I paid each man, all 8 of them, $10 each, and they seemed happy about it. I told Heap to tell them I have something I need to do down the road and I might be back for lunch. The man who said that Michael was his friend during the war asked if I were his son or a younger brother. Mr. Heap is having difficult translating to these people then. Mr. Heap says this man is convinced that I know Michael after he told him that I knew Michael back in the United States and Michael had asked me to say hello to the people who lived in this area. These were words that I did not say, but something Mr. Heap created in his mind to try and break contact. I was given one of their Mountain Yards bracelets indicating a good friend. At last, I got away from eating that Mountain Yard type food. I remember how I was forced to eat it back in 1968. It had the foulest smell and tasted so bad that I was sure I was going to throw it back up in 68. Once again, as proof that I was here back in 68, I said I remember when there was a fence around the village with metal fence posts. Each post back in 68 had a VC head planted on top of the post. I said there were a lot of trees carved with the faces of people. See photo above. I described a man who was very tall and carried a large cane that he would hit people. When they heard that, they laughed, indicating they knew that man and he had died years ago. They wanted to know if I wanted to see his grave, and I said no, I just saw him a couple times but never spoke to him. I decided I did not want to continue these missions because of the van fuel line breaking down so many times. We would return to Saigon and get a different van. After driving for another kilometer, the van came to another halt, and the driver was once again attempting to repair the persisting fuel line issue. The constant breakdowns were becoming frustrating, and I couldn't help but feel vulnerable. If I were to encounter trouble, outrunning the police on foot would be impossible, especially given my current situation. While we stopped at a cafe, a young Vietnamese girl approached the driver and inquired if he could take her to the next town, offering to pay a fee for the ride. The driver agreed, and she entered the van, taking a seat behind the driver. However, upon seeing me near the back seat, the young girl became apprehensive and changed her mind. This led to an argument between the driver and the girl. Deciding to avoid the complications of using a hotel and my American passport in the city, I opted to lie down and get some rest. Staying in the city was unauthorized for me as an American. Eventually, the driver persuaded the young girl to stay, especially after 2 older women also paid him a fee for a ride to the next major city. These elderly women had vegetable baskets with them and placed them in the seats beside me, before quickly drifting off to sleep. It appeared that, despite having paid for a 16-passenger van, the driver was attempting to make extra money on the side by picking up additional passengers without my consent. I spoke with the driver about this, and he explained that he was moonlighting to earn extra income. I agreed, but I emphasized that he needed to consult me and receive my approval before taking on additional passengers. I was wary of having a group of unknown men in the van, especially if they happened to be former VC members. The following morning, we picked up another woman who took a seat in front of me. The other passengers on the van soon discovered that I was American, and this new woman who identified herself as a former North Vietnamese entertainer and began to share her story. She explained that she used to travel from VC camp to camp entertaining soldiers, and that her husband, who was once a major, was no longer part of her life. She expressed a desire to sit beside me, but I declined, shaking my head in refusal. She then conveyed her request to Mr. Heap, suggesting that maybe I could talk to the driver and persuade him to refund her a significant sum of money she claimed to have paid for the van ride. I apologized to her and explained that she should discuss the matter directly with the driver. Darkness had now fallen, and my driver was concerned about the van's reliability as it had been breaking down approximately every 3 miles on our journey back to Saigon. Seeking some rest, I stretched out in the back seat, attempting to get some sleep. However, the VC woman in front of me began turning around and stroking my chest and tried to pull down my shorts. In a matter of seconds, she was sitting on top of me. I gently pushed her away, causing her to fall onto the aisle floor of the van. She seemed upset but still managed to smile. She began conversing with Mr. Heap, who explained that the VC woman was quite fond of me and had never encountered a man like me before. It was probably the first time in her life that a man had told her no. I asked Mr. Heap to inform her that I was married, to which he replied that he had already told her. The driver chuckled and began observing us through the rearview mirror. In many socialist Asian countries, marital status often matters little to women you meet along the road, as many of them are primarily seeking a bit of extra income. It was daylight, and I found myself sitting upright in the van. The VC woman had also awakened, and she mentioned that she still had her husband's VC military belongings. She suggested that I might be interested in purchasing them and proceeded to provide Mr. Heap with her address. I agreed to visit her after I had showered and enjoyed breakfast at my hotel in Saigon. Upon arriving at Kim Hyung's hotel, the owner, a former movie star, greeted us warmly and prepared breakfast for Mr. Heap, the driver, and myself. In the early afternoon, we headed to the VC woman's house. An elderly woman answered the door and then grasped my wrist, guiding me to the back of the house. She pointed to a room, and I entered, initially assuming it was a rather untidy bedroom. However, it turned out to be a bathroom, and the woman was standing there naked, drying her hair. Upon seeing me, she hastily turned away, and I promptly retraced my steps to the front of the house. Mr. Heap asked if she was at home, and I explained that the elderly woman had led me to a room where the woman was in the middle of a shower. I explained the situation to Mr. Heap, who then conveyed my apologies to the elderly woman. She explained that she had assumed I was the VC woman's boyfriend and hadn't realized otherwise. The VC woman emerged from the bathroom dressed with wet hair. Mr. Heap offered another apology, but she appeared unbothered by the incident. I inquired about her husband's military war souvenirs and expressed my interest in seeing them and possibly making a purchase. However, she informed me that these items were not at her house and suggested she would visit my hotel that evening. In Vietnam, it is customary to receive money as an introduction fee when connecting someone of importance with another. That evening, the VC woman arrived at my hotel, accompanied by a much younger woman with a face covered in acne. She introduced the younger girl to me, explaining that she had spent most of her life in South Vietnam, where she had learned English from American soldiers as a young girl. The younger girl, who was 28 years old, mentioned that the VC woman was her older sister, and she now resided in the South with their mother after their father's passing in Hanoi. She expressed her desire to apologize for her sister's earlier behavior and shared her hope to secure assistance from me in order to immigrate to the United States. She explained that their mother had previously worked for the U.S. government but had passed away a few years ago. I regretfully informed her that she was ineligible for immigration since her mother was no longer alive. This news brought tears to her eyes. Subsequently, she told me that her sister wanted to see my hotel room as she had never been inside a hotel room before. The three of us proceeded to my room on the second floor, and I opened the door to allow them to peek inside. The VC woman entered the room behind me, closing the door, while her sister remained outside. To my surprise, the VC woman locked the door and extended her hand, expecting me to give her money. I firmly shook my head, declining her request. She pointed at the bed, then made a circle with her index finger and thumb, following it with the index finger of her other hand, suggesting that she was looking for money in exchange for sexual services. I acted as if I didn't understand her request, finding it hard to believe that her sister was waiting just on the other side of the door while she attempted to solicit me for sex in exchange for $5. It was a surreal situation that I couldn't quite grasp. The VC woman positioned herself in front of the doorway, effectively blocking me from opening it and pushing her out. My concern was that if I refused to pay her, she might scream rape, potentially leading to police involvement. During my training, I had been explicitly told that it was illegal to have a woman in my hotel room with the door closed. However, in this case, it was the VC woman who had closed the door, putting me in an awkward predicament. Fortunately, Mr. Heap arrived just in time and engaged in a conversation with the VC woman. She eventually turned around, opened the door, and left the room. The younger girl apologized once more for her sister's inappropriate behavior. I explained the situation to Mr. Heap, and he agreed that it seemed like her primary motive was to extract money from me, an American traveler. Throughout my journey, I made sure to take photos of the people I encountered. The following day, the owner of the van service approached me and explained that the van I had been using was 8 years old. He offered to provide me with a new van for an additional $600 on top of the $400 I had already paid for the next 14 days. I found this to be quite costly and told him I would seek other options. He suggested that he might be able to arrange for a different van from another owner at a lower cost. The van's owner also mentioned that his current driver didn't want to continue driving for me. The driver was planning to immigrate to America soon and didn't want to risk any accidents on the road that might affect his health. I got the impression that my James, who had been present during these discussions, might be benefiting financially from this situation. It seemed that the driver had had enough of the recent drama and was concerned about potential legal issues involving the police due to my presence. I decided to contact Janet, the American woman I had met at the beginning of my journey, and informed her that I had returned earlier than expected due to the van's fuel line problems. She expressed the desire to meet, and we agreed to rendezvous at the Kim Hyuam Hotel. Our meeting lasted only half an hour, during which Janet mentioned that she planned to visit Da Nang and Hue. We discussed the possibility of meeting again when I reached those cities, and she provided me with the names of the hotels where she would be staying in each location. The police detective I had hired eventually located the woman I had been searching for. She was the one who had been a young girl in 1968 when I arrived in Vietnam and who had saved my life. The detective explained that he had encountered difficulties in finding her using her old South Vietnamese identity card and requested an additional $200 for his efforts. I handed him $20, which seemed to upset him, but he accepted it and departed. Now, sitting in front of me was a middle-aged woman who seemed curious about my identity. She believed that I had rented a room from her mother during the war and had returned to find her. To confirm my identity, I showed her the old ID card, and her eyes widened in recognition. I asked her if she remembered the American soldier who had held her hand when she alerted the American soldiers about the VC mine hidden under the sandbags. I told her that the soldier was me. I was the one who had held her hand on that day. That was when, back in 1968, she broke free from our conversation and ran away in fear of reprisals from the local police. I found her ID card in the clear plastic shopping bag or purse that she had left behind. I had held onto it all these years and never turned them over to the American MPs. Mr. Heap was handling all the translation work, and I had reservations about his trustworthiness. To confirm the person's identity, I subjected her to a series of questions about that particular day, and she successfully answered them. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Heap might have been providing her with the responses to my queries. I attempted to decipher her body language, which seemed to suggest that she was unaware of the incident's details, but she possessed the correct answers. I relied on Mr. Heap as my translator, but I was uneasy about the signals his body language conveyed. It appeared as though he was aiding her recollection, likely because I had briefly mentioned the July 1968 incident to Mr. Heap beforehand. So, in my assessment, she had passed the test. She inquired about my current destination, and I informed her that I needed to drive up to Hue. However, we encountered numerous issues with the van and had to return to Saigon. Shortly after our return to Saigon, the van owner informed me that the police wanted to speak with me. I firmly responded that I had not yet returned and they could wait until I did. The van owner was incredulous at my refusal to comply with the police's request once he relayed that I had to meet with them. Consequently, we now had a new van and a new driver, and I didn't place as much trust in the new driver as I did in the previous one. We left the hotel and proceeded down Levancy Street, where the driver insisted on stopping for breakfast. I had no intention of going to see the police, and I'll just talk my way out of it claiming translation problems. As we journeyed north on Highway 1, I found myself with ample time for reflection. My thoughts drifted back to an American woman named Janet Siebel. In my mind's eye, I envisioned her and I exploring these cities together in a cyclo. So far, it was one of the most enjoyable moments of this trip for me. When the mind is idle, it has the capacity to wander and indulge in fantasies, and mine certainly did. I eagerly anticipated the prospect of reuniting with her. Further along our route, we encountered another police checkpoint where the officers lacked a jeep or motorcycle. I instructed the driver to simply continue driving past the checkpoint, despite his initial reluctance. Mr. Heap said something to support my decision, and the driver complied, leaving the police behind, unable to catch up with the swiftly moving van. My estimate would be that we would encounter these checkpoints on nearly every entry and exit route into major cities. I had grown weary of the police extorting tips from the driver to allow us to proceed down the road. I feared that if the police approached the van and saw me inside, they might demand to inspect my travel documents. We repeated this maneuver 3 times in a single day, bypassing police checkpoints only if there were no jeeps or motorcycles alongside the police. My rough estimate would be that we were stopped by the police approximately 30 times during this journey. As we became aware of a white Jeep-like vehicle tailing us, attempting to catch up, the driver suggested pulling off the side of the road. However, I advised Heap against it, fearing that these pursuers might be bandits, and we didn't want to take any chances. Instead, we decided to try and outpace them. The driver was visibly frightened, and I informed him that if we were intercepted, I would claim to be in fear of being robbed and possibly harmed by these potential bandits. That was the excuse I planned to use if we were halted. So we ascended a steep hill with no road guardrails. We maintained a brisk pace, jostling around inside the van due to the numerous potholes. At one point, we took a sharp corner and noticed that the Jeep veered off the road and down the hill, while we continued onward. The driver found this situation quite amusing. I quipped to Mr. Heap that I enjoyed living on the edge and asked if he believed the police might open fire on us. He replied affirmatively, stating that they would if they were armed, but most of them did not carry firearms, rendering them incapable of shooting. We eventually reached the city of Quang Ngai and decided to pause at the beach. A Vietnamese man, who happened to be a schoolteacher on an outing with his students, spotted me and inquired if I was American. Mr. Heap confirmed this, expecting a friendly interaction. However, the man grew infuriated and instructed the children to collect rocks and throw them at our van. We quickly got back into the van and drove past him and the children. In a moment of frustration, I mimicked a shooting gesture with my hand, imitating the recoil of a gun. This action further angered the man. Mr. Heap advised me to refrain from such behavior, as it could lead to significant trouble for him. I spotted the sign from a light and instructed the driver to turn onto that road. As we drove past the old French fort, memories from 1968 flooded back when I was newly arrived in the country. I had been dispatched on a chopper to deliver supplies to soldiers on the ground. The pilot, mistakenly believing I belonged to that infantry group, directed the door gunner to tell me to disembark, even though it wasn't my intended destination. Unaware at the time that this was the site of the My Lai massacre, I found myself stranded since there was no helicopter available to return me to LZ Bayonet. That night, we came under attack, and tragically, some of the men inadvertently fell into a minefield, resulting in a couple of casualties. The following day, I was eventually extracted. Now, in 1990, I had returned to the same place. A small group of Americans had dedicated their efforts to constructing a school near the village, but the Vietnamese government had turned it into an anti-American tourist attraction. During our visit to the area, I sat down on a wall and ate one of my military MRE meals. An elderly woman sat beside me, attempting to sell various trinkets to tourists. She spoke English and shared that she had been a young girl in 1968 when the tragic events unfolded. She explained that, according to her, everyone in the area was associated with the Viet Cong, VC, back then, which she believed was a grave mistake. The VC had trained villagers in making traps to target American troops. When the Americans arrived, the villagers would flee, leading the Americans to chase them into a minefield. One fateful day, while she was at the market with her mother, the Americans arrived and caused a large number of casualties. The VC returned that night and ordered the villagers to bury the deceased. Later, they instructed them to inflate the death toll, making it appear as though hundreds had perished. When I asked her about the total number of Vietnamese people who died that day, she couldn't provide an exact figure. She also recounted how VC soldiers frequently visited the village, taking young girls and resorting to violence if their commands weren't followed. This instilled fear among the villagers, as disobedience could lead to fatal consequences. In her view, the VC had caused more casualties in the village than the Americans had. I recorded this conversation, as I had with all the others. After lunch, we resumed our journey northward. Subsequently, I penned a letter to former Lieutenant Bill Colley, who was the officer accused of murdering a few hundred Vietnamese villagers. He was court-martialed and later was granted a pardon by President Richard Nixon. At this time, he resided in Atlanta, Georgia, and worked as an insurance salesman. In my letter, I recounted the story, and he responded by sharing his perspective. Lieutenant Colley emphasized that one must experience combat and witness the loss of comrades while observing Vietnamese individuals creating traps intended to harm American soldiers. He noted that these locals often feigned ignorance when questioned about VC minefields, despite having assisted in their placement. Lieutenant Colley also mentioned the challenges of taking prisoners, as they would frequently attempt to escape, resulting in fatal consequences when they were shot. He admitted that he had always harbored doubts about the accuracy of the reported casualty figures but lacked precise knowledge of the true extent of harm caused by his soldiers. While we were driving back on Highway 1, not far from Chulai, I witnessed an old American 212-ton truck overtaking another vehicle at high speed on a section of the road with a solid surface. As I scanned the road ahead, I noticed a young Vietnamese woman stepping onto Highway 1 without checking for oncoming traffic. Tragically, she was struck by the passing truck, which didn't stop. The truck ahead of us slowed down and came to a halt, prompting me to instruct my driver to stop our van as well. Swiftly, I grabbed my military first aid medical kit and rushed towards where the woman lay. A crowd of Vietnamese people had gathered around, and I asked them to stay back while identifying myself as an American doctor medic. Gently, I touched her shoulder and attempted to assess her condition. However, when I noticed that her entire chest had been severely injured and her blood was streaming away from her lifeless body, I realized that there was nothing I could do. I returned to the van and awaited the return of the driver and Mr. Heat. Emotionally moved, I felt a deep sense of sadness and wished I could have done something to keep her alive until we reached a hospital. Even though Da Nang was 62 kilometers away, the woman appeared to be in her 20s or 30s. I couldn't help but wonder why so many people crossed streets without looking both ways. I would unfortunately witness similar accidents numerous times in the years that followed. It was heart-wrenching to know that I couldn't save everyone, although I managed to help a few, but only a few. This incident occurred just 8 years ago, and the memory still brings tears to my eyes. On a separate occasion, while I was in Scranton, Pennsylvania, at the Tobyhanna military compound, I observed an accident where the driver responsible for the collision drove away with an undamaged truck. I was in a military truck when we suddenly came to a halt. We discovered a distraught woman in the front seat, trapped and in tears, unable to extricate herself from the car seat. The vehicle had overturned and was lying on its driver's side. She informed us that she had 2 children in the back seat. My driver swiftly rescued the 2 children from the car, placing them in the front seat of our truck where they continued to cry. I attempted to free the woman from her seatbelt, but it seemed to be stuck, and the engine was emitting smoke. Another vehicle stopped nearby, and I asked the driver if he had a knife or if he could acquire one from a nearby cafe. Climbing inside the front door opposite the woman, I used a knife to cut the seatbelt, carefully lifted her out of the driver's seat, and helped her exit the car. In the process, I accidentally cut my hand with the knife. The police arrived to take a report, and I provided them with the details I could recall. I explained that we were on the verge of missing our flight, and the officer allowed us to continue our journey. Later, the woman sought me out and reported the incident. As a result, I received another award, which I stashed away in my footlocker. After our encounter with the overturned car, we continued along Highway 1 and made a stop at my former base camp, Halsey Bayonet. At that time, there was a house built in the middle of the old entrance road. We parked the van and Mr. Heap, and I walked behind the house, not realizing that we should have asked for permission to cross someone's property. The old house bore graffiti carved into its walls, depicting soldiers attacking each other. I instructed Mr. Heap to convey my apologies to the homeowner, explaining that during wartime, one rarely saw permission, and I had forgotten we were not in a war any longer. I climbed up the hill, hoping to find the large boulder where I used to perch, thinking I could remain hidden from my sergeant's watchful eye and avoid being assigned undesirable tasks. Atop this massive boulder were memories of me concealed as I wrote letters home and to the girl I loved. However, to my dismay, the boulder had vanished as if it had never existed. It had been broken apart, and its rocks were purposed for road construction. I walked through a field, and dozens of villagers trailed behind me. When I turned around, they abruptly halted and began to walk in a different direction. They yelled out that there was a mine in the field ahead and warned me to be cautious. It turned out they were playing a prank on me. It did make me stop and turn around and watch my footsteps back. In my mind, I was transported back to the jungle, constantly vigilant for tripwires. Once you adopt that mindset, it's challenging to shake it off. All of this happened a decade ago in 1990, yet even to this day, when I walk through wooded areas in the United States, I find myself instinctively looking down, searching for tripwires. It's a reflex that doesn't fade away. I proceeded down the path where our former headquarters had once stood, now reduced to grass huts. As I continued along the road to the former helipad, I could still see traces of the prom hole that had been spread on the ground to control dust. I was informed that a senior South Vietnamese soldier now occupied that land. We walked along the road that used to run behind our sandbag bunkers. a place where we had encountered and engaged VC fighters on a few occasions. On the day I departed Vietnam, the soldier behind me in one of the bunkers had been struck by an incoming mortar round, resulting in the loss of his leg. I stumbled upon what appeared to be my old hooch, now concealed beneath dense jungle growth. Nearby, I found a piece of barbed wire from a fence and remnants of old sandbags. As we returned to the road to rejoin the van, we encountered a sizable group of Vietnamese people eagerly awaiting the return of the American visitor. I presented them with a photograph of Sergeant Lan, and they immediately recognized him. Someone promptly took Ohana and went to retrieve him, bringing him back to our location. I also shared a photo of a girl named Lan, and they arranged for her to join us as well. I showed them numerous pictures of the children who had assisted us in filling sandbags, but learned that some of them had moved away. One man examining the photos identified his daughter among them. Among the photographs, there was one of a boy I referred to as Jim, though his Vietnamese name was Bien. To my surprise, they informed me that he had become a police officer, but during the war, he had been associated with the VC. As my gathering attracted a sizable crowd of perhaps 100 people or more, I decided to discontinue the display, concerned that police might intervene and raise unwanted attention. I didn't seek notoriety, so we all climbed back into the van and continued our journey north, stopping at the Chu Lai Air Base. Upon reaching the guardhouse, we noticed there was no guard present, so we proceeded down the road leading to the China Sea. Our next stop was at the amphitheater, where I had attended the Bob Hope Show in 1968. To my dismay, the once thriving amphitheater lay in ruins. I was informed that former South Vietnamese soldiers who had been interned in labor camps had been tasked with destroying the entire theater since it was originally an American facility. The entire area was blanketed in broken concrete, with what seemed like deep foxholes scattered throughout. Upon inquiring about it, I learned that in 1975, thousands of Vietnamese people had congregated here, hoping to secure a boat to escape the region. Unfortunately, luck wasn't on their side, so they remained in this area for some time. Some of them had buried their gold, and now people were searching for that hidden treasure. It was a somber reminder of the hardships faced during those turbulent times. We continued along the road and reached a location known as Hill 54. A police jeep pulled up behind us and inquired about our purpose. I explained that I had lived here once, but they informed me that stopping was not allowed and instructed us to continue on the road to Da Nang. Reluctantly, we departed. In Da Nang, I secured a room at a government-owned Vietnamese hotel and settled in for the night while Mr. Heap and the driver went about their business. Later, there was a knock at my door, and to my surprise, it was Mr. Lan and Jim, my old friend from back in 1968-69. At this point, Jim had lost his ability to speak English and relied on Mr. Lan to translate. I gave each of them a $20 bill, accompanied by a wink as a token of appreciation. They suggested taking me to a disco, so I got dressed, and we headed across the street and up a few floors to a room filled with very young couples. As the band played Berlin's Take My Breath Away, Jim initiated a VN custom by taking my hand. We strolled down the center of the spacious room, and people respectfully made way for us as though we were royalty. We eventually paused in front of the stage, and people willingly vacated their tables and chairs for us. Some of these individuals appeared to know Jim, and I overheard him chuckle and say, "me," pronounced as is he but meaning American, as he proudly introduced me to his friends. Jim ordered beer for all of us, and we attempted to converse, but the music was too deafening. Eventually, I made my way back to my room, explaining that I had to depart for the city of Hue. Mr. Lan, also known as Sergeant Tom, expressed their desire to accompany me on my journey. However, Mr. Heap was cautious and voiced concerns about Jim, referring to him as a VC policeman, suggesting we might not be able to trust them. He also reminded me that I lacked the necessary travel papers. Ultimately, we made the decision to leave early in the morning without informing Jim or Lan, although I did mention that I intended to stop at Hill 54 upon my return in a couple of days. While driving through the city of Da Nang, we came across another accident unfolding right before our eyes. We stopped to observe, as did everyone else on the street. Two small Honda motorcycles had collided, and the two riders were trying to get up. One of the men was screaming at the other, and tensions escalated quickly. The angry man drew a handgun and aimed it at the other man's head. In response, I instructed Mr. Heap to stay close behind me and declared loudly that I was an American. I then asked Mr. Heap to inquire if I could be of any assistance. Mr. Heap initiated a conversation, and the man with the gun scrutinized us intensely before holstering his weapon and engaging in a dialogue. We waited for a few minutes, during which Mr. Heap shook his head, indicating that this individual was a secret police officer who could have easily shot the man and fabricated an excuse for the killing. A large crowd gathered around as we spoke. We eventually returned to the van and, upon looking back, saw that both men and their motorcycles had disappeared. Mr. Heap reminded me of the absence of travel papers and the potential complications that could arise from getting involved in domestic disputes. Mr. Heap must have reminded me of this 100 times, sometimes when he did not want to go into some places. We stayed at the same hotel where Janet Siebel had mentioned she was staying. I inquired with the hotel clerk about her presence, and he confirmed that she was indeed at the hotel. He placed a call to her on my behalf, and when she returned to the hotel, she sought me out. Mr. Heap appeared quite taken aback when he saw us together, and Janet sat uncomfortably close to me on a sofa meant for four. He inquired about how we had met, and I shared the prearranged story as Janet had instructed me. I explained that she had mentioned she was headed to Da Nang and that perhaps we would cross paths at this particular hotel. I harbored doubts about Mr. Heap's trustworthiness. He seemed like someone who might betray me for personal gain. Janet and I had a conversation, and she agreed to join me on the van ride to the City View. Around 8 p.m., she visited my room and invited me to hers. Having acquired French red wine and cheese from the market but unable to consume it all on her own, I accepted her invitation, and in her room she expressed a keen interest in hearing the stories I was permitted to share on my adventures so far. I recounted most of the tales, aiming to amuse her, and I watched as she attempted to suppress her laughter. She chuckled, particularly when I mentioned Mr. Heap taking me to a bar where a girl emerged from under the table, prompting her to ask if that incident had genuinely occurred. I confirmed that it had indeed happened. Later, when I mentioned taking a shower and an elderly woman entering to bathe me, Janet sat closely beside me, hand-feeding me cheese and a type of Vietnamese egg roll with shrimp inside. Janet confided in me that she intended to end her relationship with her boyfriend in Saigon upon her return and expressed hope that she wouldn't lose her job in the process. She believed it was better to be with someone she genuinely liked rather than be stuck with a business-oriented individual she considered dull. Women will tell you a lot of stories that are not necessarily truthful to gain your trust in them. This story of her boss would be one of them. Curious about my profession, she asked what type of doctor I was and sought advice regarding a cyst on her leg. Why was she asking me this if she was a registered nurse, as she claimed? Made me think she may have had some specialized training, and they made her a nurse. I was surprised by her knowledge that I had a doctor in front of my name since I had not previously mentioned it in our conversation. She humorously claimed that a little bird had informed her about it. She then began to unfasten her pants, but I gently placed my hand on hers and told her that I wasn't that kind of doctor. She inquired about my specialization, to which I replied, I'm not your typical OB-GYN, I'm just the kind that likes to look. Janet left and playfully tapped me on the shoulder, saying, Okay, we can check that too. I explained that I wasn't qualified to come to Vietnam in search of human remains unless I had the proper credentials related to my mission. To mitigate potential issues, I underwent a training course to learn the essentials of a forensic anthropologist's work. This way, if I faced questions, I could at least navigate them convincingly. It also helped when interacting with other anthropologists, as they wouldn't offer assistance to someone unqualified. I emphasized the importance of not asking questions if I could avoid them and mentioned that we had a laboratory in Honolulu that handled the real discoveries. In the following years, I would visit this place multiple times. All of this fell under the jurisdiction of DODJPAC, the same organization that paid me and to which I indirectly reported. In addition to the fake Canadian passport provided by the Department of State, they also supplied me with a document indicating that I was board certified by the ADMA, American Board of Forensic Anthropology. My eyes rolled back into my head as I said this, indicating it was a joke of a certification. While I took a test, I suspected they might have altered my answers. I shared with her that I had received training in various mini-courses, covering almost everything needed for survival, condensing weeks or months of schooling into 1 to 3 days. However, I added that I might never have the opportunity to use most of that training, as the adage goes, if you don't use it, you lose it. Years later, I would think back to all that training and classes were a waste of time where I never had a need or an opportunity to use any of it. She questioned me for a while and joked that her cyst was probably beyond my scope of knowledge. In response, I mentioned attending medical school, where we did have a class on removing a cyst from a woman's upper leg. She responded with a sarcastic frown. I suggested that she consider consulting a Vietnamese doctor instead. Janet left briefly to make a phone call and returned, stating that she wasn't willing to expose herself to a little Vietnamese man. Curious about my background, Janet asked if I was a 00 agent, kin to James Bond with a license to kill. I clarified that such a term was British, not American, and she inquired if I had ever been assigned to kill someone. I replied with a firm no, adding that while a few individuals had died on my watch, there were only those who truly deserved it. I asked her if she had ever heard the term send someone a letter. She asked if that was term used like in the movie The Godfather when Don Corleone said make him an offer he can't refuse. I told her I was trained on other ways to eliminate threats that didn't involve a knife or gun and leaves no forensic. You're a Mr. Bond, aren't you? She said. I concluded by mentioning that I was not trying to feed my ego or boost myself by trying to impress her, and I would prefer not to discuss such matters, whether legal or illegal, explicitly, leaving room for interpretation. Janet settled back into her seat, and we turned on the TV. It displayed photos of family members lost due to the war or other reasons, with relatives searching for them. Janet mentioned that she spoke English and French and a bit of Vietnamese, though not enough for extended conversations. She shared that some Vietnamese Americans had returned to Vietnam in search of long-lost family members from decades ago. As the program concluded, a young Vietnamese girl appeared advertising a Honda motorcycle on the TV screen. Janet explained that these girls had to make certain compromises with their partners or business associates to secure these jobs selling Honda motorcycles on TV. A hotel clerk then arrived at the door, and his expression seemed to suggest he might have to report that there was a man in her room. I asked about the other bottle of wine, and she replied that this one was her favorite, suggesting I should remember the name if I ever wanted to surprise her one night and perhaps receive a reward moving her head in the direction of her bed. Playing along with her suggestive hints, I asked what would be my reward, and she said she might let me look at her cyst. With a smile, I informed Janet that I needed to return to my room and that another glass of wine might render me unable to make it back. She offered me the option to stay the night, watch the soccer game on TV from her bed, and reassured me that nothing would happen unless I desired it. I laughed and commented that such words usually come from someone with different intentions. Nonetheless, I declined the invitation, telling her I would see her in the morning, though I immediately regretted my decision. It seemed my life would be filled with missed opportunities. I had remained sexually faithful to my wife all these years, and I didn't want to change that status with an overnight fling. The following morning, we checked out of the hotel and climbed into the van after a light breakfast. We embarked on the journey up the High Van Pass, a lengthy drive up an exceedingly steep and treacherous mountainside where accidents claimed lives every day. Along the way, we encountered a couple of accidents involving cars and trucks that had rolled off the road and tumbled down the hillside. It was widely recognized as one of the most perilous stretches of road in all of Vietnam. Observing the wreckage of the vehicles that had rolled down the hill, I couldn't fathom how anyone could survive such accidents. Further up the road, we encountered a disturbing scene. The dark, viscous substance resembling black water flowing down the road, bringing traffic to a standstill. Upon reaching the source of the commotion, we discovered a catastrophic accident. A lugging truck, its cargo of logs stacked much higher than what one might consider legal, had veered off the road, rolled down the hill, and obliterated a bus, resulting in the tragic loss of over 30 lives. Many bodies lay side by side along the roadside, just behind the bus. Our driver, somewhat desensitized to such occurrences, mentioned that he witnessed such incidents frequently. As we approached the summit of the mountain, we encountered a burnt-out truck by the roadside reduced to its metal frame. The sight included 4 tires that had melted into the pavement. We were informed that accidents were a daily occurrence on this perilous hillside. Upon reaching the mountain summit, we encountered a rest stop and spotted some of the old Japanese pillboxes from World War II. A group of children gathered around Janet and me, eager to sell their assorted trinkets. Among them was an elderly woman carrying an infant with a deformed mouth, who hurried across the street towards us. The old woman proceeded to open the child's mouth, inserted her grimy finger, and then removed it, subsequently rubbing her stomach to convey that the child had nothing to eat. In response, Janet informed the old woman that she was Soviet, using the term lienso, which essentially meant I won't buy anything, and I'll slap you silly if you don't stop annoying me. Janet's translation to me when someone continued to pester her. Janet shared this translation with me and chuckled. The old lady, undeterred, moved away and approached another group of people from a different bus, attempting once more to solicit handouts. Most people simply sidestepped her, having witnessed such scenarios countless times and recognizing it as a scam. Sadly, these children were often rented or even kidnapped to exploit the sympathy of tourists for monetary gain. As the children continued to peddle their trinkets, I overheard Janet responding in Vietnamese that she was Soviet when they thrust their tourist wares in her face. However, she didn't stop there. With a mischievous grin, she switched to speaking Russian, a move that initially alarmed me. But then she turned to me, her eyes gleaming with amusement, and stated that she believed these children could speak Russian. To test her theory, she declared, Okay, I'm Fab, French, and the children promptly conversed in French. Okay, I'm American, she declared next, and just as swiftly, they switched to English. Amazed, I inquired about how many languages they could speak, and some of the children proudly claimed they could communicate in 4 different languages. Janet explained that the elderly woman with the child had been in Vietnam for considerable time and had quickly learned about all the various scams these individuals employed, exploiting children to elicit sympathy from foreigners and thus garner larger donations was a common tactic. Therefore, Janet advised that it was often best to assert that you were Soviet to deter their persistence. The children mentioned that Catholic nuns taught them these languages to facilitate selling to foreigners. Over the years, I would often claim to be Soviet, French, or Italian, and the children would respond in those respective languages. As we stood atop the hill, our driver refueling the van, Janet and I found ourselves on a former Japanese pillbox that offered a breathtaking view of the ocean below. Janet took my hand in hers and marveled at the beauty of the place, suggesting it would be one of the most stunning locations in Vietnam to build a house with such a view. I glanced down at our entwined hands, and she playfully remarked that it was better for us to appear as husband and wife to deter other women from trying to invite me out for the night. I laughed and allowed her to continue holding my hand as we returned to the van. She, in turn, allowed me to hold her hand as if she might stumble without my support. Her words to me, little did I know then that she was a skilled fighter in the style of Jackie Chan and didn't actually need a man's assistance for anything. Janet had a hidden fierceness, ready to transform into a violent tiger at any moment. As we descended the far side of the mountain, a charming fishing village came into view, and I couldn't help but think what a splendid place it would be to live. Upon arriving in the city of Hue, we found a hotel overlooking the Perfume River. Janet expressed her desire to stay in my room, where we would each have separate beds but could maintain the appearance of a husband and wife traveling together. Much later, Janet revealed to me that her boss didn't want me to get into any trouble with a Vietnamese woman. Hence, she was asked to accompany me as my wife, which might have been the reason for her presence on this trip. Is she telling me the truth, or just a story in order that I allow her to accompany me? I keep remembering in my training that I should never trust anyone. Added note 1998. Janet would reveal parts of her life each evening that we were together, and I learned. So I wrote a long summary of her here, which is really a separate story in itself. Janet Sable, a native of Langley, Virginia, embarked on a tumultuous journey that began with her early years in the local educational system, her father working for a federal agency. However, her life took a sharp turn when, at the age of 16, she became a mother. Despite being married shortly afterwards, her world crumbled when, just a month after giving birth to her daughter, she discovered her husband in an intimate encounter with another pregnant woman. Swiftly responding to the betrayal, Janet initiated divorce proceedings. In the midst of personal upheavals, Janet made a significant decision to join the Marines. Determined to forge her own path, she entrusted the care of her daughter to her mother and continued her education while rising through the ranks of the Marine Corps. Her remarkable ascent in the military culminated in her becoming a black belt trainer, showcasing both her dedication and prowess. However, Janet's journey took another turn when she caught the attention of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCSA. Her commendable achievements led to an offer to work with this prestigious agency. She was very close to her father, who worked for the federal government in Langley, which may have impacted her ability to move up the rank. When her reenlistment came due, she refused to reenlist after her initial term due to bureaucratic constraints. Subsequently, another government agency sought her skills, and she underwent further training before being deployed to the Philippines. In the Philippines, Janet became associated with a company operating in Chi Minh City, specializing in trade issues. Her boss, who eventually became her boyfriend, focused on matters involving the Vietnamese government. In December 1990, she was assigned a mission to locate a man named Roger at the Kim Huong Hotel in Saigon. Now, some of the following story was written for a book where I was using one of my aliases of Michael Walker, my great fifth grandparent. Instead of changing the name back at this time or rewriting this part of the story, I'll continue as Michael Walker. Her task shifted to befriending Walker and enlightening him on the intricacies of Vietnamese laws that could impact his travels as a tourist. The notion of her trying to find a different American named Roger served as a mere cover, concealing her true intentions during the initial stages of our interaction. During my mission from Saigon, Michael Walker, me, confronted a multitude of challenges. Among these hurdles was an interpreter primarily interested in extracting tips from Michael's travels. This interpreter, Mr. Heap, recommended specific hotels and places to visit and places to eat for the driver, and the interpreter charged exorbitant fees, with the majority of the money going into the interpreter's pocket. Additionally, Michael grappled with transportation issues. as his vehicle frequently broke down due to a fuel filter problem every few miles. Amidst these difficulties, while all this was going on, Michael continued to pursue a personal mission on his own. Confronted with these difficulties with his traveling vehicles, Michael had no choice but to return to Saigon to secure a more reliable vehicle that could facilitate his travels. At this juncture, Janet received instructions to discreetly rendezvous with Michael during his journey. Her role was not only to shadow him and ensure he steered clear of trouble, but also to provide assistance in accomplishing his missions. Michael harbored suspicions that Janet was not merely a companion seeking to travel with an American for leisure. The abrupt decision to leave her job in Saigon to accompany him raised questions in his mind. Initially, he considered the possibility that she might be a Soviet secret police operative. I was trained to never trust anyone, even if they indicate they are here to help you, they could still be working for the other side. Spies are everywhere, and money talks. As time passed, his conjectures evolved, and he entertained the idea that she could be affiliated with the CIA or some other government agency. The mystery surrounding Janet's motives fueled Michael's growing skepticism and intrigue. This is the end of a story I wrote about Janet Siebel. For some mysterious reason, she refused to allow me to photograph her, but I was still about to obtain some. Back in the city of Hue in December of 1990, Janet conversed with the hotel clerk, who informed her that they only had one room left, primarily used by newlyweds. The rooms in this hotel were quite pricey at $70 a night, and although Janet mentioned having an expense account, she claimed she couldn't afford it. I agreed to cover the cost, and she promptly clarified that we were strictly friends with no romantic involvement, whether in the dark of night or in broad daylight. I gave her a questionable look, not understanding, and she placed her tongue on the inside of her mouth and pushed it out, unaware of what that meant other maybe some slang gesture. The room itself was vast and exuded luxury, featuring antique, substantial furniture and large beds. I walked over to the double French doors, opened them, and stepped out onto the balcony, taking in the picturesque view of the river below. A minute later, I heard the doors onto the other balcony to the right of mine open, and Janet walked out with Mr. Heap by her side. She gazed at the breathtaking view of the perfumed river below and exclaimed, "Isn't this beautiful? Can you imagine waking up in the morning and having breakfast out here?" She turned to me and added, "It would also be lovely to have a late dinner on this balcony while listening to the music from the club below." It was indeed a magnificent view, although it offered a stark reminder of the surrounding poverty. Nevertheless, I could appreciate the romantic ambience it could provide for two lovers. Janet then spoke to the bellboy, who smiled at me, before disappearing with Mr. Heap. We began unpacking, each of us having separate beds situated about 4 feet apart. She suggested that we could share one bed to save the maid the trouble of making up both beds in the morning. Her actions and words were sending me mixed signals, leaving me unsure of her intentions. We are sleeping here as friends, and now she wants me, her friend, to sleep in the same bed with her. Once we finished unpacking, we returned downstairs and waited for our driver. Then we set off in search of Mr. Louis Nguyen, the Frenchman I had been sent to find. I had an address, but the numbering seemed to be reversed compared to what was written on my paper. Nevertheless, we asked people along the street, and eventually we found his house. The small house was surrounded by a stone wall with a metal entrance gate. We rang the bell for a few minutes until an old man hobbled to the gate. I asked if he was Louis Nguyen and mentioned that I had heard he was a photographer. He inquired if we were Americans, to which I replied affirmatively. He then expressed his desire to practice his English, apparently forgetting the secret handshake and password laughs. I humorously told him that I had been speaking English all my life. He invited us inside and began showing us his collection of flowering plants. Among them, there was an old World War II French helmet, upside down, with a flowering plant growing from it. He mentioned that he had worn that helmet during his time as a soldier but no longer did. He said he once fought at Dien Bien Phu, the place of the defeat and surrender of French forces, but didn't say on which side he served. We took a seat, and a young girl brought out 3 tiny teacups and poured hot tea for us. After a few sips, I got to the point and told him I was searching for a photographer who might have some wartime movies or photographs to sell. He examined my camera, a Nikon FM with a 105mm lens, and was quite impressed. He then asked if the woman beside me was my wife, and I clarified that she was just a friend. In response, Mr. Louis suggested that I should marry her because she was young and beautiful and would give me many sons. Janet, standing beside me, rolled her eyes and flashed a playful smile. Mr. Louis went on to explain that during the Resistance War, he had lived in Hanoi and worked with the North Vietnamese government, capturing photographs of American war crimes against the Vietnamese people. He mentioned that he had a 16mm film that might pique my interest, and I eagerly expressed my desire to see it. However, as more cups of tea were poured, the conversation seemed to be dragging on for too long. Mr. Louis conversed with Janet in French, but she halted him, emphasizing that I was there to purchase photos from him. I concurred, adding that we needed to leave soon and requested to see what he had to sell. The young girl, who had been serving tea, brought out a cloth bag and handed it to Mr. Louis. He then passed it to me, saying that this was what I had been seeking. I peered inside the bag and found a 16mm film reel, about 28 minutes in length. It appeared to be the same film that Kim Hyun, the owner of my Saigon hotel, had shown me when she was a movie star. In a playful manner, I jokingly asked if it was Debbie Does Dallas, but my attempt at humor didn't seem to resonate with him. Janet gave me a subtle ribbing, signaling me to stay focused on business and not make light of the situation. Mr. Louis cautioned me to handle the film with care since it was old, and he mentioned that he had many more reels like this one. Being in his 70s, he expressed his desire to sell everything. I asked him how much I owed him for the film, but he surprisingly said it was free. I then told him about my plan to visit Kisan and possibly spend the night there, as I wanted the distinction of being the first returning American to stay overnight at Kisan on my own. He nodded in agreement, although I wasn't sure if he fully understood my intentions. I inquired whether Janet could arrange to have the 16mm film converted into a VHS tape. However, I wasn't aware at the time that the electrical system in Vietnam operates on a different frequency, hertz, which meant that I wouldn't be able to view the video on a VHS tape without an electric converter when I returned to the United States, 50-60 hertz. Meanwhile, we embarked on a 2-hour tour of the city. Janet held my hand most of the time, and when local Vietnamese people asked her about us, she explained that we had recently gotten married. As a result, they often bestowed upon us small wedding gifts when we made purchases. During our tour, we made a stop at a video rental shop that specialized in converting 16mm film to VHS tape. The owner gave me a curious look and inquired whether I had been a soldier during the war. Janet answered on my behalf, confirming my past military service. He then extended his hand in a friendly gesture, and while chatting, he asked if I would be willing to mail a letter for him upon my return to the U.S., to which I readily agreed. Janet also inquired if the shop had a VCR player available for rent and whether they had any bootleg American movies for sale. She managed to procure 2 movies, one of which was titled Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. We made the necessary payment, and the shop owner offered to come to our hotel and set up the VCR player in our room. Later that evening, the shop owner arrived at our room, and his shock was evident as he took in the size of our accommodations. He efficiently set up the VCR player and began playing the first movie, assuring us that he would return in the morning to collect the equipment. I quickly removed the Indiana Jones movie and inserted the new Louis Nguyen tape, which turned out to be a silent film depicting American EOWS outgoing torture. In the film, these EOWS were shown naked with their hands bound behind their backs, suspended off the floor, and beaten with bamboo canes. The camera captured their expressions of agony as they were struck. Subsequently, the film showed different men being interrogated in the same manner, with their hands restrained and bodies suspended. If their responses were unsatisfactory, they faced further beatings. To my astonishment, I witnessed an American POW strangling another American, a scene that left me profoundly shocked. My understanding of the situation had been that they wanted this film to identify living Americans in Hanoi during the war, rather than those who had perished in plane crashes, as claimed by Hanoi. I was unaware at that moment that one American could kill another, especially under such severe conditions. Watching an American commit such an act made me realize that this was precisely what they had sought to capture on film. Though I couldn't identify the man at the time, I would later speculate that he might have been a U.S. senator who was a POW during that period. Nobody had explicitly told me not to make a copy, but I did so, thinking I might anonymously pass it on to the American League of Pals. Janet, however, chose not to watch the movie instead. She went downstairs and got a bottle of wine and cheese, then returned to the room, keeping her eyes off of the TV until it was finished. She took the tape out of the player and put it in the Jones movie. We settled on the bed and enjoyed watching Indiana Jones together. Janet seemed to enjoy being close to me, and our hands remained intertwined throughout the movie. When the film came to an end, she suggested that we unwind further with a massage. She mentioned that there was an all-night massage spot just down the street. All night? I questioned, and she chuckled in response. We ventured to the massage spa, where we were greeted by 2 women dressed casually. They informed us that they would like to start with a sponge bath and led us to a room containing 2 green water pools, each about 4 feet in size. Following their instructions, we undressed and entered the pools. A folding silk curtain separated Janet and me, so we could only see each other's silhouettes. Afterward, we dried off, donned green bathrobes, and were directed down a lengthy corridor. We lay down on tables side by side, where we received a thorough sponge bath or deep scrub. I was somewhat perplexed about the green water pool's purpose. I had assumed that was where we would receive the sponge bath from Vietnamese females. But I never found out, and it seemed Janet might have had a change of plans. In the scrubbing room, only one girl spoke English, and both girls were dressed rather scantily. Janet expressed feeling being exposed in the room, and I replied that I had on my birthday suit except for my robe. Janet then reconsidered and said she simply wanted the massage. We got up, put on clean set of green robes, proceeded down the hall, and lay on separate tables side by side. They had portable walls that could be slid between the tables, and asked if we wanted a partition between us. Janet declined, mentioning that we had seen each other naked before. I inquired when that had happened, and she humorously responded, "In our minds." I laughed, and she winked at me. I had a growing suspicion that this spa might be a euphemism for an all-night brothel.
This is the end of part 1 of 2 parts of my tenure as a high-paid tourist. Please look for part 2 of my tutor as a high